Welcome to Horror Echo. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from and the time. Now, relax and join me on a journey into the unknown. The Midnight Shift. Chapter 1, The Job Offer. The call came in the dead of night, with the air outside heavy, thick with humidity. Mark rubbed his eyes, still half waking from a restless sleep on his couch. His phone buzzed again, the ringtone unfamiliar. Reluctantly, he answered. "Hello?" he croaked, trying to sound coherent. "Mr. Thomas? Mark Thomas?" "Yes, who's this?" "This is Clara from the Greystone gas station," the voice on the other end responded. "We're in need of someone to cover the midnight shift. Can you come in tonight?" Mark sat up. The Greystone gas station wasn't far, about 20 minutes outside of town. He'd heard of the place, mostly because of the odd stories surrounding it. Locals whispered about strange noises, flickering lights, and customers who'd gotten lost in the labyrinthine halls of the small station. But, in all honesty, Mark wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. He was a practical man, grounded in reality. What interested him most was the pay. "Midnight shift, huh? And you need someone now?" he asked. "Yes, Mr. Thomas." "The position is urgent," Clara answered, her voice cool but pressed. "The pay is generous. Are you interested?" The urgency in her tone made him pause. He'd been job hunting for months with no luck, and this was an offer he couldn't pass up. The small, cramped town wasn't exactly booming with job opportunities, and the promise of steady work and extra cash was hard to resist. "Yeah, I'm in. When do I start?" "Right away," Clara said. "We'll see you in about an hour, Mark." The call ended abruptly, and Mark was left staring at his phone, wondering about the strange tone in Clara's voice. He'd heard rumors about the station, stories that people who worked there sometimes didn't come back. But these were just small-town tales, stories that kids told each other during sleepovers. Yet, a cold chill ran down his spine. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the quietness of the night. But whatever it was, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Still, he shook it off, stood up, and grabbed his jacket. Work was work. Chapter 2, Strange Beginnings. The drive to the Greystone gas station took longer than he expected. The road was narrow, and the trees pressed in on either side like silent sentinels. It was dark, darker than he had anticipated. The kind of darkness that didn't feel natural. As he pulled into the gas station's lot, he noticed that the station was far more run down than he had imagined. The flickering fluorescent lights above the pumps cast eerie shadows on the cracked asphalt, and the tall, rusted signs swayed in the wind, creaking with every gust. Mark took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. He parked in front of the entrance and stepped out of his car. The air smelled stale, a mix of gasoline and something else, something he couldn't quite place. As he walked to the door, he saw the faintest movement inside, like a shadow shifting across the window. It startled him, but he chalked it up to his imagination. When he pulled open the door, the bell above it gave an odd, metallic jangle. It was so sharp that it made him wince. Inside, the station was dimly lit, and the smell of old coffee lingered in the air. There were shelves full of snacks, magazines, and miscellaneous items. But the place felt abandoned. Even though there was a cashier's counter, no one was behind it. Mark looked around but saw only dust and a few cobwebs in the corners. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing through the empty space. "Is anyone here?" There was no response. He stepped further inside, walking down the narrow aisles. The only sound was the creak of the floor beneath his boots. It was unnerving, but still, he couldn't afford to back out now. He'd already committed. He needed the money. After a few moments of wandering, a door behind the counter creaked open. Out stepped Clara, a tall woman with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. She smiled when she saw him, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. It was as if she were forcing herself to smile. "Ah, Mark. You made it," she said in a voice that was almost too sweet. "We were starting to worry." "I'm here." "So, what do I need to do?" Mark asked, trying to ignore the strange feeling that was creeping in around the edges of his thoughts. Clara gestured for him to follow. "You'll be managing the night shift. There's not much to it, just watch the store, make sure the pumps are working, and keep the lights on." "Sounds easy enough," Mark said, but the unease continued to build. He followed her to the back room where a small desk sat beside an old, humming computer. The room was stuffy, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. "Any other instructions?" Mark asked as Clara handed him a set of keys. Clara's eyes narrowed, and she hesitated. "Just be careful," she said softly. "Things aren't always as they seem here. The station has a history." Mark raised an eyebrow. "What kind of history?" "Don't worry about it," Clara replied quickly. "You'll get used to it." As Clara left him alone to settle in, Mark sat at the desk, trying to get comfortable in the stale air. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 11:30 p.m. Only a half hour before his shift officially began. The station was quiet, but there was something unsettling about it. The hum of the air conditioner seemed louder than usual, like it was struggling to keep up with the oppressive heat. He glanced at the monitors showing the outside pumps, and everything appeared normal. But then, something caught his eye. One of the monitors flickered for a split second, and then, he saw it. A shadow moved in front of one of the pumps, blocking the light from the station's exterior floodlights. He blinked and looked again. No one was there. The shadow disappeared, but the chill remained. Chapter 3: Flickering Lights. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadow outside had been nothing more than a trick of the light, he told himself, but something still didn't sit right. The lights in the station flickered again, causing him to glance up at the ceiling. He rubbed his eyes and looked down at the computer screen, trying to distract himself. The air grew heavier. Every time he looked out the windows, the darkness seemed to press him closer, as though it were alive. Something about the place was suffocating. He couldn't put his finger on it. It wasn't just the darkness, it was the silence. Then came the first customer. A car pulled up to the pump. Mark glanced up from the counter and saw a man step out of the vehicle. He was tall, dressed in a heavy jacket despite the warm night air. His face was obscured by a baseball cap, and Mark couldn't quite make out his features. "Can I help you?" Mark called, trying to sound casual. The man said nothing at first. He approached the pump and began filling his car. Mark watched for a moment, then turned his attention back to the monitor. There was something odd about the way the man was moving, almost stiffly, like a puppet with invisible strings pulling him. And then the lights flickered again, and Mark's heart skipped a beat. The man was no longer at the pump. He hadn't seen him walk away. He hadn't heard the door to the car open. Yet, the car was still there, the pump still hissing with fuel. A cold wind whipped through the air, carrying a faint whisper. Mark froze. It was faint, but he could have sworn he heard someone whispering his name. This first part of the chapter introduces the unsettling environment of the gas station and hints at something supernatural, setting up a foundation for future chapters to expand on the eerie happenings and strange occurrences at the station. ChatGPT. Chapter 4: Unseen Forces. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the whisper grew louder, though the source remained elusive. His eyes darted from the monitor to the pumps outside. The car that had been filling up just moments ago now sat empty, its engine running, but there was no sign of the man who had been there. The strange feeling in the pit of Mark's stomach deepened. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. His legs felt unsteady, like they might give way beneath him. As he walked cautiously toward the door, he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the air thick and suffocating, yet oddly cold. He pushed the door open and stepped outside. The parking lot was bathed in an eerie glow from the street lights, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. The car was still there, parked at the pump, but there was no sign of the man. No sound, no movement. Mark's breath came in short, uneven gasps as he slowly approached the car, his eyes scanning the surrounding area for any sign of life. Then, just as he was about to reach the vehicle, the engine cut off. The headlights flickered once, then went dark. Mark froze, his heart racing in his chest. The sound of the engine had stopped as if someone had simply turned it off, but there was no one in sight. The sudden silence felt oppressive, almost suffocating. Mark turned back toward the station, his mind racing. What the hell was going on? His instincts screamed at him to get back inside, but something held him there, paralyzed. He glanced once more at the empty car and then heard it, a soft creaking noise, followed by the faintest whisper again. It was behind him. Mark spun around, but the parking lot remained empty. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath, but the feeling of being watched never left. The air felt thick, as if it were pressing down on him from all sides. He had to get back inside. With a sense of urgency, he turned on his heel and hurried back toward the door. As he reached for the handle, a shadow darted across the corner of his eye. Mark's pulse spiked. He yanked open the door and stumbled back inside, heart pounding. The flickering lights above him gave an eerie, staccato rhythm, like a heartbeat coming from the darkness. Mark stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The air felt heavier, and as the door swung shut behind him, he heard the whisper again, clearer now, as if it were right next to him. "Get out!" Mark's blood ran cold. He could barely make sense of what was happening, but one thing was certain: the gas station wasn't just empty, it was haunted. Something wanted him gone, and it wasn't going to let up. He looked around the room, his eyes searching for any sign of movement, any clue to what was happening. He had to find out more. But then, before he could make a move, the door to the back room creaked open. Clara emerged, her expression unreadable. "I heard you outside," she said calmly, as if nothing were wrong. "Something happened?" Mark opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain it? How could he tell her about the strange man, the whispering voices, the feeling of being watched? I don't know," he stammered, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. I heard something. A voice. It's like..." Clara raised her hand, cutting him off. "It's okay," she said softly. "You're just getting adjusted. This place has a way of doing that." Mark's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" Clara smiled, but it was a hollow, unsettling smile. "This gas station, it has a history. It's been here for a long time, longer than most people realize. And it doesn't let people go easily. Mark's heart raced again. He took a step back, trying to put some distance between himself and Clara. What do you mean, it doesn't let people go? Clara's smile faded, and she glanced around the room, her eyes darting nervously toward the dark corners of the station. You'll understand soon enough, she murmured. But don't worry. Just do your job, and you'll be fine. The station doesn't bother you unless you make it angry. Angry? Mark asked, his voice rising in disbelief. Are you telling me the station is alive? Clara's gaze shifted to the door, as if she were listening for something. She looked back at Mark, her expression unreadable. More or less, she said cryptically. There are things in this world that we don't understand, Mark. Things we can't explain. Before he could respond, the lights flickered once again, and a cold draft swept through the room. Mark shuddered. Clara's eyes widened, and for the first time, Mark saw genuine fear in her gaze. I have to go, she said quickly, her voice low. You'll be fine. Just stay inside and keep the doors locked. And whatever you do, don't go outside after midnight. With that, she turned and left through the back door, leaving Mark alone in the suffocating silence. He could still hear the faint whispering, now louder, echoing in his ears. Leave, before it's too late. Chapter 5. The Midnight Visitor. The clock struck midnight, the sound of the chimes echoing eerily through the station. Mark sat at the counter, his mind racing with the conversation he just had with Clara. What had she meant? Was this just some sick joke, or was there truly something wrong with the gas station? He glanced up at the clock again, his eyes wide. The hands moved slowly, ticking away, marking the passage of time. The shadows outside seemed to stretch longer, as if they were reaching for him, pulling him toward the darkness. He looked out the window, but the parking lot was still empty. Then, suddenly, the bell above the door jingled. Mark spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The door had swung open, though no one had entered. He looked again. A tall, thin figure stood at the doorway. Mark's breath caught in his chest. The man from earlier, the one he thought had disappeared, was standing there, just outside. His face was still obscured by the brim of his cap, but Mark could see something else. The man's skin was pale, almost translucent. His movements were slow and deliberate, like he was gliding rather than walking. Can I help you? Mark asked, his voice shaking. The man said nothing. He simply stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the station. The air grew colder as he moved closer, the temperature dropping rapidly. Mark's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The man stopped just a few feet away from him and tilted his head slightly, as if studying him. Mark opened his mouth to speak again, but the man raised a finger to his lips in a silent gesture to be quiet. Then, with a sudden movement, the man reached out and touched the counter with a cold hand. A jolt of electricity shot through Mark's body, and he staggered back. His vision blurred for a split second, and then, as if someone had flipped a switch, everything went dark. Mark blinked, disoriented, his heart pounding. He glanced around the station, but the man was gone. The door was closed, and the room was silent once more. Had it all been a dream? But then, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the counter, where the man's hand had touched, the words "Leave now" were scrawled in dark, smeared writing. Chapter 6. Into the Darkness. As Mark stood there, staring at the words etched into the counter, he felt a chill creep up his spine. The air was cold again, and the lights flickered once more. His heart raced, the pounding in his chest deafening in his ears. He couldn't make sense of what had just happened. One moment, the man had been there, and the next, he was gone. But the message remained, burning into his mind. Leave now. Mark turned away from the counter, his hands trembling. He couldn't stay here. Not now. Not after everything he'd experienced. He had to leave. He turned and grabbed the keys from the back room, his mind racing with fear. But as he reached for the door, the whispering began again. Leave, now, before it's too late. The voice was clearer this time, louder, almost as if it were speaking directly into his ear. Mark hesitated, his hand still gripping the door handle. Something inside him told him that leaving might be a mistake. The station was alive in a way that defied logic. It had a hold on him, and now it didn't want to let go. The whispers grew louder. Mark turned, his heart pounding. Something was coming. Something was about to happen. Something that would change everything. To be continued. This portion begins to expand the eerie atmosphere of the station, slowly ramping up the tension and preparing the stage for more mysterious and ghostly events. The next chapters would build on this growing sense of fear and helplessness, unraveling the terrifying history of the station and the entities connected to it. ChatGPT. Chapter 7, The First Sign. Mark's hand hovered over the door handle, his breath shallow, as if the very air around him was holding its breath, waiting for him to make his move. The whispering had stopped, but the silence that followed was just as unnerving. It wasn't a normal silence, it was heavy, pressing down on him like a weight. He could feel it in his bones, a tangible, suffocating presence in the room. He closed his eyes for a moment, shaking his head as if to clear it, trying to force reason into his racing thoughts. It's just the stress, he told himself. I've been working too much, and I'm tired. I've just got to go home and get some sleep. Nothing's going to happen. But the whisper was still there, echoing in his mind. Leave now. The words felt like a command. Like a plea. Mark opened his eyes again and turned to face the room. The gas station was unnervingly still, the lights flickering intermittently. It felt as though time itself had stalled. Even the buzzing of the old fluorescent lights seemed to have lost its rhythm. He forced his feet to move, taking a slow step toward the door, but the room around him seemed to close in as though it were trying to keep him there. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. Then, a loud bang broke through the silence. Mark spun around, heart racing. The noise had come from the back storage room. His first instinct was to bolt, to run out the door and never look back, but he couldn't. His feet felt rooted to the floor, as though an invisible force had taken hold of him. It was the same sensation he had felt earlier, the unexplainable pull of the station, like it had already claimed him. A second bang, followed by the sound of something scraping across the floor, echoed from the back room. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. His hand clenched around the door handle. He had to leave. He couldn't stay here. But something was drawing him toward the sound. He hesitated for a long moment, the conflict raging inside him. He didn't want to go near whatever was in that back room, but curiosity, no, more like compulsion, drove him forward. He forced his feet to move, his pulse thudding in his ears. As he passed through the dimly lit aisles of the gas station, his eyes darted to the shadows, trying to catch any glimpse of movement. But there was nothing. When he reached the back room door, it stood slightly ajar, and the shadows inside stretched like claws, beckoning him. Mark slowly pushed the door open, his breath coming in short bursts. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering bulb overhead. In the far corner, something was moving. Mark's heart skipped a beat. It was as if something were scuttling across the floor. The sound was unnerving, like nails scraping against tile. He squinted into the darkness, trying to make out what it was. And then, the light flickered one final time before going completely dark. The room plunged into pitch blackness. For a moment, Mark stood there, frozen in terror. His breathing was all he could hear now, and the scraping sound had stopped. But then, a soft rustling noise came from the far corner. The sound of something, or someone, breathing. It's just my imagination, Mark thought, but his body betrayed him. His feet were already moving backward, towards the door. I should have listened to Clara. I should have left. But then, from the darkness, came a voice, soft, raspy, and unmistakable. Mark. His blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice he had heard in the whisper earlier. The same voice that had come from nowhere, telling him to leave. He froze in place, his heart hammering in his chest. Mark, it whispered again, and this time, it was right behind him. Before he could react, a cold, clammy hand clamped onto his shoulder. He yelped and spun around, his mind racing for an explanation. But there was nothing there. The back room was empty. The floor was undisturbed. There were no signs of life, no one hiding in the shadows. Mark's eyes frantically searched the room, his chest tight with panic. He took a step backward, his mind telling him to leave, to run, to never look back. But then, as his foot hit the threshold of the back room door, the whispering started again. It was louder this time, and it was coming from every corner of the station. Leave now. Mark staggered backward, stumbling as he tried to steady himself. His body was frozen in fear, every muscle tense. He could feel the presence of something around him. Something watching him. And then, the flickering lights overhead gave one final flash before going dark. Chapter 8, The Truth Revealed. The darkness that engulfed the station was absolute. Mark's heartbeat was the only sound he could hear, pounding in his chest, his breath quick and shallow. He stood motionless in the complete blackness, his skin crawling, every nerve in his body screaming at him to run. But his legs refused to move. This isn't real, he told himself, but the rational thoughts he tried to cling to seemed to slip further away with every passing second. The longer he stayed in this oppressive, suffocating dark, the more it felt like reality itself was unraveling. Then, a light appeared in the distance, small, like a flickering candle. Mark squinted, trying to make sense of it. It was coming from the far corner of the gas station. The same corner that had been shrouded in darkness only moments before. The whispering grew louder. Leave, now. Mark forced his legs to move, stepping toward the light. It grew stronger as he neared it, revealing what had been hidden in the corner, the source of the light. A figure stood there, bathed in the glow of a single candle. It was Clara. But she didn't look the same. Her eyes were hollow, her face gaunt and pale, and her hair hung limply around her face. She was staring at him with an unsettling intensity, her lips curled into a sad, twisted smile. Clara? Mark's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. She didn't respond, but the air around them seemed to grow colder. The whispering continued, but it was now joined by a low, guttural sound, like the growl of an animal. It was as if the very walls of the gas station were alive, a living, breathing thing that fed off the fear that had taken root inside him. Clara raised a hand, pointing toward the back room. Mark's gaze followed her finger, and his stomach lurched. There, in the shadows, he saw something else, something that hadn't been there before. It was a door. A hidden door, one that had never been there during his previous shifts. And beyond it, a faint, flickering light, like a distant beacon of hope, or perhaps a warning. Mark turned back to Clara, but she was gone. The light from the candle vanished with her, and the whispering grew louder. Chapter 9, The Final Choice. Mark stared at the door, his mind in chaos. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to get out of this place before it was too late. But the door beckoned him. Whatever was behind it, it held the answers. He had to know what was happening here. He had to understand why the station was haunting him. He stepped forward, his breath catching in his throat as his hand reached for the doorknob. His heart thudded in his chest as he turned it, the door creaking open. Beyond the door lay a narrow hallway, dimly lit by flickering lights. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the hallway itself was alive, pulsing with energy. Mark hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity won over his fear. He stepped into the hallway, and that's when he saw it. At the end of the hall stood a mirror. A large, ornate mirror, its frame dark and weathered. The reflection in the glass wasn't his own. It was something else, a figure, cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. Then, the whisper came again, this time from the mirror itself. "Leave, now." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He reached out, his hand trembling as he approached the mirror. The figure inside it seemed to move closer with every step he took. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't turn back now. The mirror's surface rippled like water, distorting the reflection. And then, everything went black. Chapter 9, The Final Choice. Mark stared at the door, his mind in chaos. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to get out of this place before it was too late. But the door beckoned him. Whatever was behind it, it held the answers. He had to know what was happening here. He had to understand why the station was haunting him. He stepped forward, his breath catching in his throat as his hand reached for the doorknob. His heart thudded in his chest as he turned it, the door creaking open. Beyond the door lay a narrow hallway, dimly lit by flickering lights. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the hallway itself was alive, pulsing with energy. Mark hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity won over his fear. He stepped into the hallway, and that's when he saw it. At the end of the hall stood a mirror. A large, ornate mirror, its frame dark and weathered. The reflection in the glass wasn't his own. It was something else, a figure, cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. Then, the whisper came again, this time from the mirror itself. "Leave, now." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He reached out, his hand trembling as he approached the mirror. The figure inside it seemed to move closer with every step he took. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't turn back now. The mirror's surface rippled like water, distorting the reflection. And then, everything went black. Chapter 10, Beyond the Mirror. The blackness engulfed Mark entirely, suffocating him. The world around him became nothing but a thick, impenetrable void. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. It was as if he had been swallowed by the dark, an endless abyss. His chest felt tight, and his lungs strained for air, but there was no air, no oxygen, nothing but the cold weight of the darkness pressing down on him from all sides. Then, a sudden shift. A cold gust of wind brushed against his skin, sending chills through his body. Mark blinked, and slowly, the blackness began to recede, as if the night itself was pulling away from him. He opened his eyes, but what he saw wasn't the gas station anymore. The space he found himself in was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was a room, dimly lit by an ethereal light, and the walls were covered in old, faded wallpaper, peeling away in spots as though time itself had been worn down by the years. There was no sound, save for the soft creaking of the floorboards beneath him, and no sign of life, just an overwhelming feeling of stillness, like a place untouched by time. But in the center of the room, a large mirror stood, framed by the same intricate carvings he had seen in the hallway. It was enormous, its surface smooth and unblemished, reflecting the room around it. The reflection, however, was not what it should have been. Instead of the room, the mirror showed a vast, endless void, like the world outside was being erased by some unseen force. Mark's heart raced again, but now there was a new sensation, one that stirred a deep fear in his chest. He was being pulled toward the mirror. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he found his feet moving forward, as if an unseen hand were guiding him. He tried to resist, but his body disobeyed him, inching closer and closer to the glass. And then, just as his hand was about to touch the surface of the mirror, the room around him shifted once again, and everything went dark once more. Chapter 11, A Lost Soul. Mark woke to the sound of the gas station's bell ringing, a sharp, metallic jangle that made him jump. The air was cold, colder than it had been before, and his body was stiff, as though he had been standing still for hours. He blinked, trying to adjust his eyes, but his surroundings seemed warped, as though the very air around him was distorted. The gas station was different now. The shelves were empty, the counters were covered in dust, and the lights flickered erratically, casting long, unnatural shadows. The once familiar place had become a strange, hollow version of itself, as though it had been abandoned for decades. But that wasn't what unsettled him the most. What terrified him was the presence of something, or rather, someone, standing behind the counter. Mark's heart froze in his chest. It was Clara. But she wasn't the same. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide and empty, devoid of the life that had once been there. She stood motionless, staring at him with a hollow gaze. And though she didn't speak, Mark could hear her voice in his mind, a cold, raspy whisper that sent a shiver through his entire body. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice said. It wasn't Clara's voice, but something far darker, far more ancient. Mark stepped back, his breath quickening. "What's happening?" he choked out, his voice trembling. Clara, if it was even her, didn't answer. Instead, she slowly lifted her hand, pointing toward the back room. "No one ever leaves," she whispered. Mark's eyes widened. He had heard the same words before, but now they felt like an inescapable truth. His body felt cold, heavy, as if it were no longer his own. The pull toward the back room was stronger now, an invisible force dragging him forward. He turned, but this time, his legs wouldn't carry him. He stumbled, his breath erratic as the oppressive force in the station surrounded him, pressing him toward the darkness. And then, the door to the back room creaked open. The darkness beckoned. Chapter 12, The Truth Comes Crashing Down. Mark's feet moved on their own, dragging him through the threshold of the back room. The door slammed shut behind him, and he found himself standing in the same narrow hallway that had greeted him earlier. The walls were still covered in peeling wallpaper, and the flickering lights cast long shadows that danced like specters. The air was thick with an unsettling sense of finality, like something was about to end. Mark's pulse pounded in his ears as he took a step forward, feeling the cold chill in the air grow more intense with each movement. The hallway stretched on endlessly before him, and in the distance, he could just barely make out a light. It flickered weakly, like a candle struggling to stay lit, but it called to him. Something was waiting for him at the end. With no other choice, he pressed on. As he walked, memories began to flood his mind. Vivid flashes of people, of faces he couldn't place, and of a time long past. The feeling of being here before, of having been in this very spot, washed over him like a wave. He tried to focus, but the images were fleeting, like smoke slipping through his fingers. They were memories, but not his own. And then, just as he reached the end of the hallway, the light grew brighter, blinding him momentarily. When his vision cleared, he found himself standing before an enormous, ancient door. The wood was dark and weathered, covered in carvings that seemed to shift and change as he stared at them. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, but when he touched it, a strange sensation surged through him, like a pulse running through his very veins. The door opened with a creak, and Mark stepped inside. The room beyond was vast, stretching into an abyss that seemed to have no end. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of years, of memories that had been buried long ago. And standing at the center of the room was a figure Mark had seen before in the mirror. The same shadowy, cloaked figure. It turned to face him, its face obscured by the darkness that surrounded it. Mark could feel its gaze on him, though he could not see its eyes. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the shadows seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The figure lifted a hand, and its voice, low and guttural, echoed through the room. "You are the last." Mark's heart skipped a beat. The last? Last for what? The figure took a step forward, its voice colder now, more menacing. The last to leave. Before Mark could react, the shadow surged forward, swallowing him whole. He tried to scream, but the darkness choked the sound from his throat. He struggled, his body twisting and writhing as the shadows tightened around him, pulling him deeper into the abyss. And then, everything went black. Chapter 13, Trapped. Mark awoke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. He gasped for air, but the suffocating blackness surrounded him. The gas station was gone, the hallway was gone, and the room with the figure was gone. He was back at the counter, as if none of it had ever happened. But something had changed. The station felt different now. He could feel it in his bones, the cold, the oppressive atmosphere, the weight of something ancient pressing down on him. He wasn't alone. And then he saw it. The figure, cloaked in shadow, was standing behind him. The last thing Mark saw before everything went dark was its outstretched hand, its fingers long and twisted, reaching for him. Chapter 14, The End and the Beginning. Mark opened his eyes, but it wasn't the gas station he saw. It wasn't even the dark hallway, or the terrifying mirror. The world around him was quiet, unnervingly so. His body felt weightless, as though he were floating, disconnected from the physical world. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, as though something was holding him in place. Then, slowly, a figure appeared in the distance, faint at first, like a shadow creeping through the fog. As it grew closer, Mark's heart skipped a beat. It was Clara. But this time, she wasn't the same. She looked whole. Her skin was no longer pale and withered, it was warm and alive. Her eyes, once hollow, now shimmered with something that resembled hope. A strange calm radiated from her presence, and Mark felt his fear begin to ebb away. She smiled gently, a soft, knowing smile, as if she had been waiting for him all this time. "You're awake," she said, her voice clear and soothing, but there was an underlying sadness there, something in her eyes that told him the truth. "What happened?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. Clara didn't answer immediately. She took a step closer to him, her eyes searching his face. "It's over, Mark. But it's also just beginning." Mark frowned. What do you mean? Am I? No, you're not dead, she interrupted, her voice firm. But you're no longer the same either. This place, it's a cycle. A loop that consumes souls, but it also gives them something. A chance to become part of something bigger. Something that's been here long before you ever stepped inside. Mark's mind raced. He couldn't understand. But I'm still here. I haven't left. You are, Clara agreed. But that's the thing. No one really leaves the station. Not entirely. You've crossed over now, Mark. You are bound to this place, just like I am. Just like the others before us. A cold shiver ran down Mark's spine. What are you saying? Clara's eyes darkened, and she took another step closer. The station, it doesn't just trap people in a physical sense. It traps their essence, their soul. And it waits for the right moment to take them, to make them part of this endless cycle. Mark's heart pounded as the weight of her words sank in. But you were alive, he whispered, his voice cracking. You were normal once. You had a life. Clara nodded, her gaze growing distant. Yes, I did. And I was just like you. But it took me. It took me when I tried to escape. When I thought I could break free, but it doesn't work that way. The station pulls you back, no matter how far you go. You can't run from it, Mark. You never could. But why me? Mark choked out. Why bring me here? Why now? Clara paused, her expression softening. Because you're the last one, Mark. You're the one they've been waiting for. The final soul to complete the circle. Mark took a step back, his mind spinning. The darkness, the figures, the whispers, it was all becoming too much to process. The last soul, he repeated, his voice shaking. What do you mean by that? What happens to me? Clara sighed, her eyes full of sorrow. You'll become part of the station. The energy that keeps it alive, that keeps it in this loop, is us. The souls of everyone who's ever worked here, ever stayed here. We feed it, we keep it going. Mark felt his legs go weak, the gravity of her words sinking deep into his chest. He had always thought of the station as just a strange, unsettling place, a place with rumors and stories that locals whispered about when the lights went out. But this was something far worse. The shadows that had surrounded him, that had pulled him through the hallways, were not just figments of his imagination. They were real. They were part of the station, part of the dark, twisted force that governed it. You're not the first to be trapped, Mark, Clara continued, her voice softening as she stepped closer, her hand outstretched. And you won't be the last. We are all part of the same fate now. But there is something you can do. There is still one choice left. Mark's head snapped up. What do you mean? What choice? Clara's eyes met his, her expression resolute. You can choose to stay. You can join us. Become one with the station. Or... She hesitated. Or you can take the final step. The final step? Mark repeated, confusion clouding his thoughts. Clara nodded slowly, her expression conflicted. The door you saw, the one that you found in the mirror. It's not just a passage. It's the end. Once you step through it, there's no coming back. It's not the escape you think it is. It's a choice to break the cycle, to end it for good. Mark stared at her, 1,000 thoughts racing through his mind. Could he really make that choice? Could he leave this cursed station behind? The memory of the cold shadows, the whispers, the hollow voices, it all came rushing back. And with it, the haunting realization that he had only ever felt like he had a choice. In truth, the station had been pulling him toward this moment all along. He looked at Clara one last time. I don't want to be a part of this cycle. I can't. Clara's expression softened. I understand, Mark. But you need to know, there is no true freedom. There is only the end. And when you step through that door, you will leave this place, but you'll also leave behind everyone you've ever known. No one will remember you. The cycle will begin anew. Mark's throat tightened. And what about you? Clara's eyes darkened. I'll stay. I've made my choice long ago. With that, Mark turned away, his decision made. He couldn't let himself stay in this place. The station had already claimed too many lives, too many souls. He wasn't going to let it claim his. He walked toward the door, the same door that had first beckoned him, the door to the final choice. Behind him, Clara's voice followed him one last time. Goodbye, Mark. The door creaked open as he stepped through, and just as quickly, the world around him dissolved. Story 2, The Keeper of the Lost Highway. Chapter 1, The Stranger in the Fog. The fog had rolled in thick that evening, swallowing up the road and everything in its path. Jason's headlights barely cut through the dense mist as he drove down the empty stretch of highway. The radio crackled in the background, but the static was all he could hear, as if the world around him had been muted by. It was just after midnight, and he'd been driving for hours, trying to find his way back home after a long business trip. He knew the highway well. It was an old, abandoned road that barely saw traffic anymore. It was mostly used by truckers and the occasional lost traveler, but tonight, it felt different. There was something about the oppressive quiet of the fog that made the road feel alive, as if it were watching him. Jason glanced at his GPS again. He knew this area well, but the device was showing him something strange. The map seemed to blur at the edges, and the faint outline of another road appeared, one that he was sure hadn't been there before. Is this a shortcut? Jason muttered to himself. He had no idea how it got there, but the road ahead seemed to veer sharply off the highway, taking him into deeper, more isolated woods. His curiosity piqued. He made the decision. Why not? He said aloud, turning the wheel. Chapter 2, A Road to Nowhere. The narrow road grew more twisted the further he drove. Trees leaned into the path, their branches thick with dew, creating an oppressive canopy that blocked most of the light from the moon. His headlights caught glimpses of tall, dark figures looming just out of his sight, and every now and then, the faint rustling of someone, moved just out of view. It was unsettling, but Jason kept driving, telling himself it was just the fog and the late hour playing tricks on his mind. The GPS kept glitching, showing his location zigzagging erratically. The road seemed to twist on itself, and the further he drove, the more disoriented he became. He couldn't remember passing the same trees or rocks more than once, but here they were again, all looking exactly the same. And then, through the thick fog, he saw it. A small cabin standing alone at the edge of the road. It seemed to appear out of nowhere, like a mirage in the haze. The window was dimly lit, casting a soft yellow glow that seemed oddly inviting in the otherwise oppressive dark. Jason slowed his car, his curiosity getting the better of him. He wasn't sure what he expected, maybe an old hermit or a drifter, someone who could point him back to the main highway. But as he approached the cabin, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. There was no car in the driveway. No lights except for that one dim window. A strange sense of urgency pushed him out of the car. The fog was thick, clinging to his skin like cobwebs, and the air smelled damp and musty, like old wood and wet leaves. He walked toward the cabin, his footsteps crunching in the wet grass. The front door creaked open before he even reached it, as if someone had been waiting for him. The figure in the doorway was tall, cloaked in shadow. The only thing visible were a pair of eyes, glowing faintly, like the reflection of an animal in the dark. "Can I help you?" The voice was low, rough, and had a strange echo to it, as though it didn't belong to this world. Jason froze for a moment. He wasn't sure what to say. There was something deeply unsettling about the figure. He had no idea why he hadn't turned around and left already, but he felt drawn to the stranger's gaze. Something in those eyes. It wasn't fear he felt, it was something else. Curiosity. I think I'm lost," Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was driving and I thought this road was supposed to take me back home." The figure's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're not the first," the figure said cryptically, stepping aside to let Jason pass. "But once you've taken the road, there's no going back. You can stay if you like, but don't expect to leave until the fog clears." Jason's heart pounded. Something wasn't right here. He thought about turning around, running back to his car, but for some reason, he stayed rooted in place. "Who are you?" Jason asked, his voice trembling despite himself. The figure stepped forward, slowly revealing a face that was aged beyond measure. His skin was wrinkled and pale, like old paper. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his mouth twisted into a smile that was anything but friendly. "I am the keeper of this road," he said, "and you've crossed into my domain." The words didn't fully register at first. Jason opened his mouth to protest, but the fog outside the cabin seemed to thicken, swirling as if it had a life of its own, pulling him deeper into the shadows of the cabin. "I'll show you," the keeper said softly, and without another word, he turned and walked into the dimly lit cabin. Jason hesitated for a moment, but the curiosity and the sense of helplessness were overwhelming. He followed the keeper inside. Chapter 3: The Unseen Path. Inside the cabin, the air was musty and filled with the smell of old wood and something faintly metallic. The walls were adorned with strange, worn maps, all of roads that Jason didn't recognize, roads that twisted and bent in impossible directions. The windows were shut tight, and there were no other doors in sight. The keeper walked over to a worn chair by the fire, his eyes never leaving Jason. "Sit," he commanded in a tone that brooked no argument. Jason sat, his legs stiff with unease. He could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him, like the very cabin itself was alive, watching him. "Why am I here?" Jason asked, finally finding his voice. "What is this place? What road is this?" The keeper's smile grew wider, and he leaned forward, his glowing eyes locking onto Jason's. "This is the Lost Highway," he said. "A road that few ever find, and even fewer ever leave. Those who travel it do not always arrive where they think they will. Some roads are not meant to be traveled." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "The Lost Highway," he repeated, his voice faltering. "Those who wander here, they seek something," the keeper continued. "Some seek answers. Others, redemption. And some, they seek escape. But the road always leads them back, one way or another." Jason's mind raced. He wasn't sure if this was some elaborate hoax or if the keeper truly meant what he was saying, but something in his gut told him that this wasn't just a simple detour. This road was something far more dangerous, far more ancient. The keeper rose slowly from his chair, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "But now that you've arrived, there are rules you must understand." His voice dropped to a whisper. "And the first rule of the Lost Highway is that you cannot leave until you've learned what the road wants you to learn. And what you are meant to find." Jason stood up abruptly, his heart racing. "I didn't come here for some lesson. I just need to get back home." The keeper's eyes glowed brighter, and a low, guttural laugh rumbled from his chest. "You are already home, traveler," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally around the cabin. "The road never ends. Not for you, not for anyone who takes it. It only loops and repeats." Suddenly, the cabin door slammed shut behind him. The fog outside thickened, and Jason could feel the very walls of the cabin pressing in, as if the place were alive, closing in around him. His pulse quickened, panic rising in his chest. "I have to get out of here," Jason shouted, but the keeper didn't respond. Instead, he simply smiled, his face twisted with an ancient, knowing grin. Chapter 4: The Keeper's Truth. Jason's heart thudded in his chest as he tried to force the cabin door open, but it refused to budge. It was as if the walls of the cabin themselves had solidified, trapping him inside. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of something otherworldly. Every breath he took tasted stale, like the atmosphere around him had been sealed for years, or even centuries. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but the keeper stood at the center, his glowing eyes still locked onto Jason, unblinking. His lips parted slowly, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white for a man of his age. "You can't escape, traveler," the keeper murmured. His voice was calm, almost soothing, like he was explaining the simplest of facts. "Not from this place. Not from this road." Jason's pulse quickened as panic set in. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice shaky. "I didn't ask for any of this. I just want to leave." The keeper's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're here because you were chosen, just like everyone else who wanders this road," he said softly. "You came to me, drawn by something inside you. A need for answers. A thirst for something deeper." Jason shook his head, stumbling backward. "No! I didn't ask for this. I don't even know how I got here." "You're here because you're meant to be," the keeper said, his voice growing stronger now. "This road chooses those who need to be lost. It's a road that doesn't answer your questions, it reveals them. It shows you the truth, and sometimes, the truth is not what you want to find." The keeper moved closer, his footsteps soft but purposeful. "Do you know how many souls have walked this path before you, Jason? Do you know how many people have come looking for answers, only to be swallowed by the fog in the road?" Jason felt a wave of nausea roll over him as the keeper's words sank in. "No. I don't want any part of this. I just need to get home. Please, let me go." The keeper's eyes darkened, and the room seemed to close in around them. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing with the life of the road itself. "You've already taken the first step. There is no going back, not anymore." Jason could barely breathe, the weight of his words heavy in the air. He turned to the window, desperately trying to see anything through the thick, swirling fog outside, but all he could see was the faint glow of his car's headlights, now distorted and flickering like a distant memory. "Why did you bring me here?" Jason asked, his voice low, a tremor of fear running through it. "Why the road? What is it really? What do you mean by chosen?" The keeper stood motionless, his eyes never leaving Jason. "The road," he said quietly, "is a place of transformation. A place where lost souls come to face what they've been running from. You are here because you have a choice, one that will shape your destiny. Everyone who comes here must make it. Jason felt his stomach drop. What choice? The keeper's lips curled into a thin smile. The road will show you a truth about yourself that you've been hiding from. It will reveal the part of you that you've tried to bury. And once you see it, you will be forced to decide, embrace it, or turn away and remain lost forever. Jason recoiled, his mind spinning. I don't want to see anything. I don't want anything to change. I just want to leave. The keeper's voice grew cold, his tone hardening like stone. You cannot leave, Jason. Not until you understand. Not until you've faced it. Jason turned away, his breath shallow as he tried to think of a way out. The keeper's words echoed in his head. What did he mean by facing it? What truth about himself was this road trying to reveal? The longer he stayed, the more lost he felt, both in the fog outside and in his own thoughts. Without warning, the floor beneath him shifted, the wood creaking ominously. Jason stumbled, his foot catching on the uneven planks. When he looked up, the room had changed. The cabin walls had vanished, replaced by an open field, under a dark, starless sky. And in the distance, he saw a figure, a man standing motionless under the faint light of the moon. The figure was familiar. It was Jason. Chapter 5: The Mirror of the Soul. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he saw himself standing alone in the field. He recognized the figure immediately. It was him. But something was off. His reflection stood in the distance, not moving, just staring at him with an expression he couldn't place. What is this? Jason stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The keeper's voice echoed around him. This is the road's gift to you. It shows you what you are running from, what you fear the most. Jason's hands shook as he slowly stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the figure of himself in the distance. The closer he got, the more unsettled he became. His reflection, his doppelganger, remained motionless, locked in place, yet Jason could feel the weight of its presence, like it was reaching out to him, pulling him closer with an unseen force. As Jason reached the figure, he stopped, his heart hammering in his chest. The reflection of himself had an expression that was foreign to him, cold, empty, almost as though it were devoid of any humanity. This isn't real, Jason whispered, shaking his head. This can't be me. The reflection lifted its head slowly, its eyes piercing into Jason's soul. Then, it spoke, but its voice was not his own. It was distorted, twisted, like a mirror image of his deepest thoughts. You are the one who's lost, Jason, the figure said, its voice a haunting echo of his own. You've been running your whole life, avoiding the truth that's always been with you. The road is only here to show you what you refuse to face. Jason stepped back, his breath ragged. No. I don't want this. The figure in front of him smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a knowing, predatory grin that seemed to pierce through him. You can't escape yourself, Jason. This road, this place, it will show you the truth. And when you see it, you will finally understand why you're here. Jason closed his eyes, trying to shut out the voice, but it wouldn't go away. The figure's words echoed in his head, and the fog around him grew thicker, more oppressive. It was as if the very earth beneath his feet was pulling him toward the reflection, toward his own deepest fear. What do I have to do? Jason cried out, his voice breaking. The reflection stared back at him, its grin growing wider. You have to face yourself, Jason. You have to accept what you've been hiding from all these years. Jason's knees trembled as the ground seemed to give way beneath him. the fog swirled around his body, pulling him forward into the embrace of his reflection. He could feel the weight of his own shame, his regrets, his fears. Everything he had been running from was now closing in on him, threatening to swallow him whole. He was forced to look into the eyes of the reflection, and as he did, something inside him cracked. The truth, the one he had always known, but had never been able to accept, flooded him like a wave. "You're not lost, Jason," the keeper's voice whispered from behind him. "You've always known where you are. And now, you must make your choice." Jason's mind reeled. The truth was clear now. The road had never been the problem. It had always been within him, and it was his own fear and denial that had kept him trapped. And now, it was time to choose. He was forced to look into the eyes of the reflection, and as he did, something inside him cracked. The truth, the one he had always known, but had never been able to accept, flooded him like a wave. "You're not lost, Jason," the keeper's voice whispered from behind him. "You've always known where you are. And now, you must make your choice." Jason's mind reeled. The truth was clear now. The road had never been the problem. It had always been within him, and it was his own fear and denial that had kept him trapped. And now, it was time to choose. Chapter 6, The Choice. Jason's body trembled as the weight of the truth settled into his bones. The fog around him thickened, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. The figure of himself, the reflection, stood before him, its eyes filled with an eerie knowing. It was as if it could see everything Jason had been running from, everything he had tried to bury deep within himself. And now, there was no escaping it. He was trapped in the mirror, trapped in his own mind. The road, the keeper, the fog, they weren't external forces. They were manifestations of everything he had avoided. His mistakes, his regrets, his darkest thoughts, all brought to life in front of him. "You think you can outrun the past," the reflection said, its voice a low rasp, "but it's always there, lurking. It follows you, no matter where you go." Jason's breath caught in his throat. He felt a deep pang of shame, something he hadn't fully allowed himself to feel in years. He had left people behind, left things unsaid, and it had haunted him. The path he'd taken, this road, had been a reflection of his choices, of his need to avoid facing what he'd done. The keeper's voice echoed from behind him, steady and calm. "You have a choice, Jason. You can stay here, on the road, forever lost in the fog, running from the truth, or you can accept it. You can face what you've been avoiding and finally move on." Jason closed his eyes, fighting against the wave of emotion crashing over him. "I don't know if I can do that," he whispered. "I've made so many mistakes. So many people I've hurt." The figure in front of him, his reflection, stepped forward, its grin widening. "You think you're the only one who's made mistakes? Everyone does, Jason. But not everyone is brave enough to face them. Not everyone can admit the truth." Jason's stomach twisted. The reflection's words stung, and he didn't know whether they were true or not. But one thing was clear. He couldn't stay on this road forever. He couldn't keep running. He took a deep breath and looked down at the ground. The fog was still thick, swirling around his feet, but it didn't feel as suffocating now. He realized he had been suffocating himself all along. The road, the fog, the keeper, they were all part of a cycle he had allowed to control him. But he didn't have to let it control him anymore. Jason straightened, looking up at his reflection one last time. "I can't change the past," he said, his voice steady now, "but I can choose to move forward. I can't keep running from my mistakes." The reflection's grin faltered, its eyes narrowing. You think you can move on, but what if you can't? What if you can never escape the past? I'll never know unless I try, Jason replied, his voice stronger than he felt. I won't stay here, lost in the fog, forever haunted by what I did. The keeper's voice came from behind him again, softer now. You have chosen, Jason. And now, you must face the consequences of your choice. The road will not forgive, but it will show you the way. Jason turned toward the keeper. The fog seemed to part for a moment, revealing the road once more. But this time, the road looked different. It wasn't the twisted, endless path he had been walking for so long. It was just a road, a simple stretch of pavement leading into the unknown. And beyond that, there was light. Jason stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest, but this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was out of resolve. I'm done with this road, he said, looking back once more at the keeper. I'm done with running. The keeper's eyes shone with a knowing sadness, but his lips curled into a faint smile. So be it, traveler. But remember, the road will always be here, waiting for those who need it. The fog will always return. Jason didn't look back again. He stepped onto the road, and with every step, the fog seemed to lift. It was as if the weight of his past was slowly being left behind, each step forward shedding a part of the burden he had carried for so long. Chapter 7, The Road to Redemption. Jason walked, and with each step, the road became clearer. The fog thinned until it was no longer a shadow over his every thought. He felt lighter, as if something had been lifted from his shoulders. His steps were slow but purposeful, and though he didn't know where the road would lead, he knew he couldn't go back. He had made his choice. As he continued to walk, he noticed something on the side of the road. It was a small sign, worn with age but still legible. It simply read, "Redemption is not a place, but a journey." Jason paused, staring at the sign for a moment. It wasn't what he expected to find, but it felt right. He understood now that redemption wasn't something he could just arrive at. It was something he would have to work for, something he would have to prove through every action he took moving forward. And though he didn't know what that would look like yet, he knew it was his to earn. As the first rays of dawn pierced through the thinning fog, Jason could see the road stretching out before him, unbroken, open, and waiting for him to walk it. And though the journey ahead would be hard, Jason knew that for the first time in years, he was walking towards something, not away from it. Chapter 8, The Lost Highway. As Jason walked, the fog seemed to dissipate completely, and the road ahead grew clear and bright. But just as he thought the path was ending, a new stretch of road appeared before him. A road that looked just like the one he had walked before, but it was different now. It was no longer a trap. It was simply a road, a place for him to continue his journey. And then he saw something in the distance, a figure, standing under the shade of a tree. The figure was cloaked in shadow, but Jason didn't feel fear this time. He felt peace. The figure turned as he approached, and Jason could see its face clearly now. It was the keeper. The keeper smiled gently at him. The road never ends, Jason. But now, you know the way. Jason nodded, finally understanding. The road wasn't about escaping. It was about moving forward, accepting who he was, and learning to live with the choices he had made. The keeper wasn't a force of darkness, he was a guide, a part of the journey. Jason took another step forward. And as he did, the road began to stretch out endlessly, revealing a horizon filled with new possibilities. And for the first time in his life, Jason was ready to walk it. Chapter 9, The Silent Watcher. Jason kept walking, his steps now confident, no longer burdened by the weight of his past. The road stretched on before him, and though he couldn't see the end, he didn't need to. For the first time in years, he was walking without looking back. The fog had lifted, the oppressive feeling that had once consumed him was gone, replaced by an open sky and the soft light of dawn. But something still felt off. He wasn't alone. Though the road appeared empty, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. At first, he dismissed it as paranoia. After all, he'd been through so much, and the weight of his journey had left him on edge. But the sensation wouldn't leave, like a shadow lingering just out of sight. He quickened his pace, scanning the horizon, but there was no one to be seen. The path ahead remained clear, the only sound the steady crunch of gravel beneath his boots. The sun continued to rise, casting long, golden beams through the trees lining the road. But even as the light grew stronger, the feeling of being observed intensified. Then, he saw it. A figure appeared in the distance, standing at the edge of the road. It was a tall man, wearing a dark coat, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He stood perfectly still, motionless, like a statue carved from stone. Jason's heart skipped a beat. The figure was eerily familiar. The Watcher. Jason stopped dead in his tracks. He had heard stories, whispered tales from travelers who had passed through the lost highway. They spoke of a figure, a silent watcher who appeared when someone truly began their journey of redemption. The Watcher never spoke. He only observed. But his presence was enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. Jason's breath caught in his throat. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't real, was it? But as he stood there, frozen, the Watcher's head turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Jason's. There was no expression, no emotion, just a gaze that felt like it was peeling back the layers of his soul. The road had brought Jason here, but now it seemed to be pushing him forward. There was no turning back. The Watcher raised a hand, motioning toward the road ahead. Jason hesitated, unsure of what to do. He had come so far, faced so much, and yet now, in the presence of the Watcher, he felt small and insignificant. Am I supposed to follow? Jason muttered under his breath. The Watcher's gaze never wavered. He didn't speak, but it was as if his silence had already answered Jason's question. With a deep breath, Jason nodded to himself. He had come this far. He had faced his own darkness, confronted his past. What was the Watcher but another step along the journey? Another test to face, another choice to make. He walked toward the Watcher. As Jason stepped forward, the Watcher didn't move, but the air around him seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, the way the light seemed to bend, the shadows stretching longer than they should. The Watcher was not just a man. He was something else, something ancient, something that had been part of the road for as long as it had existed. Jason stopped just a few feet away from him. For the first time since he'd entered the lost highway, Jason felt the weight of his choices press down on him again. The Watcher was here to remind him, no matter how far he walked, no matter how much he tried to leave his past behind, the road would always demand something in return. The Watcher's eyes were still locked onto his, but now there was something in them, an understanding, a quiet recognition. The Watcher wasn't judging him. He was waiting for Jason to make his next move. To choose. What now? Jason asked, his voice barely a whisper. The Watcher didn't respond. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, wrapping around Jason's thoughts. And then, with a sudden movement, the Watcher raised his hand once more. This time, he pointed toward the road, where the fog had begun to roll in again, thick and consuming. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. The Watcher wasn't asking him to turn back. He was urging him to keep going. Jason swallowed hard. This was his journey, his choice. And it was time to decide if he would continue walking the lost highway or step into whatever lay beyond it. With one final glance at the Watcher, Jason turned his back and began walking down the road. Each step felt like a weight being lifted from his shoulders. The road ahead was no longer a mystery. It was his to claim, his to navigate. And though the Watcher stood silently behind him, he knew the figure was no longer a symbol of fear. The Watcher was a part of the journey, just like the fog, just like the Keeper. The road would always be there. But Jason had learned to walk it on his own terms. Chapter 10, The Path Reveals Itself. Jason walked, and with each step, the road seemed to transform. The fog, once suffocating, began to thin, and the trees lining the path gave way to a wide-open meadow, bathed in golden sunlight. The transformation was gradual, but unmistakable. The road was no longer a labyrinth. It wasn't twisted or endless. It was simply a path. A path that led to freedom, to choice, to a future Jason was beginning to realize he could shape. He walked for what felt like hours, the scenery shifting with every step, rolling hills, a distant river, a small village in the distance. The road was no longer a place of punishment or torment. It was a place of possibility. Jason paused at the edge of the village, standing at the crossroads. There was a sign that read, "Welcome home." It felt almost too perfect, like a dream. But Jason knew better now. Home was not a place, it was a feeling. A choice. And as he looked down the road, he felt something stir inside him, a sense of peace he hadn't known before. He had walked the lost highway, faced his past, and now, he stood at the edge of something new. The future was unwritten, but Jason had already taken the first step. The next steps would be his to take, on his own terms. He smiled, for the first time in a long while. The road wasn't lost anymore. It was a path, one he could walk with his eyes wide open. Jason took a deep breath and stepped forward, toward the village, toward the next chapter of his life. Story 3, The Hollow Bridge. It was just another forgotten bridge. Old, weathered wood groaned underfoot as Clara stepped onto the narrow path leading across it. The fog had rolled in thick, as it always did when she passed this way, but tonight it seemed thicker than usual, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The moon barely cut through the mist, casting eerie shadows along the planks. The place felt deserted, abandoned, like no one had walked across this bridge in years. But Clara wasn't scared. Not yet. She had been here before, after all. She knew the bridge. It had been a part of her life for as long as she could remember. A landmark she passed on her way home. People in the nearby town told her not to go near it, that it was cursed, that it was a place to avoid. They told stories about travelers who crossed the bridge and disappeared, leaving behind only the sound of their footsteps echoing in the dark. But Clara never believed it. She had always seen it as just an old relic from a past that was best left forgotten. Tonight, though, was different. There was something in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The bridge had always been a place she passed through, never a destination. But tonight, as she walked deeper into the fog, she couldn't help but feel that the bridge was calling to her. It was pulling her in, as if it had something to show her. Something she wasn't supposed to see. The wooden planks beneath her feet creaked with every step, as if the bridge itself were awake, groaning with a centuries-old burden. She kept walking, the unease growing in her chest. The further she went, the darker it seemed to become. The mist swirled around her, thickening as though it had a mind of its own, clinging to her skin like an invisible hand. And then, as she stepped onto the middle of the bridge, she heard it. A faint whisper. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The whisper was soft at first, almost imperceptible over the sound of the wind. But it was there, creeping into her mind, a voice just on the edge of hearing. "Come closer." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes skinned the thickening fog, but there was nothing, no one. Only the bridge and the shadows that seemed to stretch out from it, wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. She started to walk faster, her pace quickening as the whisper grew louder, almost pleading now. "Come closer, Clara." It was her name. The voice had said her name. She hesitated, her foot hovering over the next step. There was something wrong, something ancient about this place. But it wasn't enough to make her turn around and leave. Clara had never been one to shy away from curiosity. And then, from the depths of the fog, something moved. It wasn't a person, or anything that resembled a person. It was a shadow, something darker than the night, stretching out from the other side of the bridge. It seemed to shift and pulse, as though it was alive, and it was coming closer. Clara's breath caught in her throat, but she stood rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The shadow moved with purpose, its shape growing clearer as it approached her, until Clara could make out a figure standing on the far end of the bridge. It was tall, taller than any person she had ever seen. And its face was featureless. A blank, smooth expanse of shadow, like a mask that had never been carved. The figure didn't speak, but Clara felt the weight of its gaze, even without eyes. It was staring at her, and she could feel it, deep in her chest, pulling at something she didn't want to acknowledge. Without thinking, she took a step back. And then another. She was running now, her breath coming in sharp gasps, her heart racing. She couldn't see the figure anymore, but she could feel it. It was following her, matching her pace with eerie precision. Her foot caught on one of the planks, sending her stumbling forward. She gasped, her hands reaching out to catch herself, and as her fingers touched the wood, she felt something shift beneath her. The bridge, it was moving. The boards beneath her feet began to warp, twisting and groaning like an old ship in a storm. The mist around her thickened, swirling like a vortex, and suddenly, Clara found herself unable to breathe. The air was thick with something ancient, something that didn't belong. And then the voice whispered again. "You can't leave." "Not yet." Clara's chest tightened, panic bubbling up from within her. She pushed herself to her feet, looking for the end of the bridge, but all she could see was more darkness. She was lost. Lost in the fog, lost in the shadows, and lost in whatever had been waiting for her on the other side of this cursed bridge. Her foot hit the next plank, and the bridge groaned in protest. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Come closer." But Clara had already made her choice. The choice to find out the truth. And whatever truth lay beyond the fog, beyond the hollow bridge, she would have to face it. Clara's pulse pounded in her ears as she fought against the panic threatening to overwhelm her. The bridge beneath her feet had stopped groaning, but the air felt thick with an oppressive weight, as if something ancient and powerful was watching her every move. She didn't dare turn back, not now, not with that figure still out there, lurking in the fog. The path before her seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into the endless mist. Each step felt heavier, the boards beneath her feet now warped and uneven. She could feel the shift in the bridge itself, as if it were alive, breathing in sync with the rhythm of her heart. The fog twisted and curled around her like fingers, reaching for her, pulling her deeper into its cold embrace. Suddenly, The figure appeared again, standing in front of her, blocking the way. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was taller than before, much taller. The absence of a face was more pronounced now, the featureless darkness stretching across its head like a void, an endless abyss. The figure made no sound, but Clara felt its presence as if it were an explosion of energy, a surge of power that rippled through the very air. She had to move. There was no more time to question what was happening. Her legs screamed for movement, and with a burst of adrenaline, she darted to the side, desperately trying to pass the figure. But as she moved, the fog seemed to shift again. The bridge, it was changing. It no longer felt solid beneath her feet. The wooden planks were giving way to something darker, slick and cold, like the surface of a lake just before it froze. With every step, the mist grew thicker, the shadows more oppressive, swallowing up her surroundings until the world felt as though it had disappeared entirely. The figure, whatever it was still there, not moving, just watching her, its hollow presence filling the space. Clara could feel it, even without looking directly at it. It wasn't just a physical being, it was something that existed beyond the bridge, beyond the fog. It was a presence, a force that existed to test her, to pull her deeper into the mystery of the bridge. "Come closer." The voice was clearer now, not just a whisper but a command, a beckoning that felt like it was pulling her very soul. The words wrapped around her, threading their way into her mind, until she couldn't tell where her thoughts ended and the voice began. Clara stopped. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, everything around her went silent. The figure stood motionless, but now, something in the air was shifting. The shadows seemed to distort around it, bending and warping like the very fabric of reality was being stretched. The air turned colder, biting at her skin, as if the bridge itself were becoming part of something far darker, something that defied all logic. She glanced at the figure once more, her body paralyzed by the sheer force of its presence. It was as if it was waiting for her to make the one decision that would change everything. "You belong here," the voice whispered, closer now, right behind her. Clara spun around, but there was no one there. The voice echoed in her mind, filling her thoughts, making her question everything. "I don't belong here," she said aloud, her voice shaky but resolute. The fog around her shifted. The mist seemed to break, and suddenly, she could see the end of the bridge, the darkness thinning, revealing a faint light. But it was distant, almost unreachable, like a star too far away to touch. The voice laughed. A low, guttural sound that sent a chill through her spine. "You can run from it, but you can never outrun the truth. It has already found you." Clara's heart skipped a beat. The truth. She had always felt something pulling at the edges of her memory, something distant but undeniable. She had heard the stories about the hollow bridge, tales of people crossing and never coming back, of the strange happenings around this forsaken place. But those were just stories, weren't they? Her feet moved of their own accord. She wasn't sure why, but she felt as if the bridge itself had chosen her, as if there was no turning back. She took one step, then another. Each one felt like a choice, like a pact she was unwillingly making. But with each step, the fog lightened, the shadows pulling back, and the presence of the figure began to fade. Her breath steadied. There was an undeniable sense of calm that started to seep through her, a warmth in the air that had been missing only moments before. And then, before she even realized it, the bridge was behind her. The fog had parted entirely, and Clara stood at the edge of a clearing. The moonlight bathed the area in a soft glow, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara felt free. The road ahead was clear, the path stretching out before her, leading into the unknown. She was standing in a place of peace, of resolution. She had crossed the hollow bridge. She had faced its challenge. But there was one thing she knew for sure. The road was not over. Not yet. Clara stood at the edge of the clearing, the weight of what had just transpired settling in her chest like a heavy stone. The bridge had faded behind her, its dark and oppressive presence gone, swallowed by the fog and shadows. For a brief moment, she considered turning back, looking to see if the figures still lingered in the distance, waiting. But something deep inside told her that there was no going back. The road ahead, whatever it was, had to be walked, and it was hers to navigate. Her breath was shallow, a mix of lingering fear and an unfamiliar sense of calm. She had crossed the hollow bridge, but she knew, without question, that crossing it didn't mean her journey had ended. In fact, it felt like it had only just begun. The clearing before her was bathed in moonlight, an eerie quiet surrounding her, the kind of silence that makes every movement feel exaggerated. The air was crisp, the sharp chill of the night biting at her skin. There was something else though, something that wasn't quite right. The clearing felt too still, too perfect in its tranquility. The trees surrounding the open space were tall and silent, their dark silhouettes stretching toward the sky, but there was a wrongness to it all. The ground beneath her feet felt soft, like it was absorbing her every step, unwilling to let her go, as though something was pulling her deeper into the earth. She couldn't place it, but it was an overwhelming sensation that wouldn't leave her. She hesitated for a moment, feeling her stomach churn uneasily. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know you're being watched, but you don't know where to look. Clara's eyes scanned the shadows, but they offered nothing, just the same blank, empty silence that had followed her since she stepped off the bridge. Suddenly, a sound broke through the stillness. A faint rustling. No, more like a scraping. It came from the trees. Clara froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. She looked toward the source of the sound, but it was too dark, the shadows too thick to make out anything clearly. Yet she felt it, the weight of something moving, something alive. Another rustling sound, louder this time. Her breath hitched, her instincts screaming at her to turn and run, but her legs refused to move. Something kept her rooted in place, something that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "Hello?" she called out into the silence, her voice shaky but loud enough to cut through the heavy air. She heard it echo back at her, stretching the sound further than it should have been able to go. The rustling stopped. And then, a low voice answered her, its tone almost too soft to hear. "You've crossed the bridge, haven't you?" The voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was something unnerving in its certainty, as though it had always known that she would be here. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected anyone, or anything, to answer. She wasn't even sure she had been expecting anything at all, really. She had felt the pull, the strange urge to keep moving, but hearing another voice, another presence, disturbed the fragile peace she'd just begun to feel. "Yes," she replied, her voice faltering as she tried to make sense of the situation. "I crossed it. But what is this place? Where am I?" There was a long pause, so long that Clara began to think the voice might have been an illusion, or perhaps just the wind playing tricks on her. But then it spoke again, this time closer, much closer. "You're in between now," the voice said. "The hollow bridge is the threshold, a doorway between worlds. You've crossed, but now you must understand why." Clara swallowed hard. Her mind was racing with questions, but the one that stood out above all others was the most obvious. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why was I brought here? What is this place?" The rustling returned, But now, it wasn't just rustling, it was something more deliberate, something with purpose. Clara felt a shift in the air around her, the kind that makes you feel as though you've crossed a line, like the atmosphere itself had changed its rules. And then, the figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, or at least, it looked like a man. His body was tall and imposing, though his features were too obscured by the shadows to make out clearly. The outline of his form shimmered, as if his body wasn't fully bound by the world he stood in, as though it were flickering between this reality and another. His clothes were dark, blending into the night as he took slow, measured steps toward her. But it wasn't his appearance that held her attention, it was the feeling he gave off. The feeling of being stared at from all angles, as if he were not just a part of the world, but also a watcher from beyond it. "You're here because you've chosen," the figure said, his voice deep and resonating, like a distant echo coming from the dark spaces between worlds. "I didn't choose anything," Clara replied, her voice a bit stronger now, though the chill that ran down her spine told her otherwise. "I didn't ask for this." The figure stopped a few feet in front of her, his presence somehow filling the clearing, his gaze fixing upon her. Despite the darkness, Clara felt his eyes, as if they pierced through her very being. "You think you didn't choose," he said softly, his voice holding an unshakable certainty. "But the bridge doesn't let you choose. It chooses for you. It shows you what you've always known, but have never dared to face." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to step back, to run. But she stood still, locked in place by the unblinking stare of the figure, who now seemed less like a man and more like a force, like something ancient, bound to the land, to the very bridge she had crossed. "The hollow bridge is a test," the figure continued. "Not of strength or resolve, but of truth. It is a doorway that reveals the parts of you that have been hidden, the parts you've buried. Everyone who crosses it must face those truths, whether they want to or not." Clara shook her head, trying to push away the rising panic that threatened to take over. "What do you want from me? Why show me this?" The figure took a step closer, his shadow stretching unnaturally long across the ground, blending with the darkness around them. "You've already seen it, Clara. The bridge did not bring you here by accident. It has shown you the parts of yourself you've kept locked away. The fear, the regret, the things you've done and the things you haven't done. Now, you must decide." "Decide what?" Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "Decide if you can move forward," the figure answered, his voice gentle but carrying the weight of 1,000 years of knowing. "Decide if you can forgive yourself." Clara stood there, trembling as the weight of his words pressed down on her. She didn't want to face the truth. She didn't want to confront the parts of herself that had been buried for so long, the mistakes, the regrets, the things she had never been able to let go of. She had tried to run from them, but now, it seemed that running was no longer an option. "I can't," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't forgive myself." The figure nodded, as if he had known what she would say. "Then you will remain here, forever. The bridge will hold you, keep you trapped in the in-between, a place where time has no meaning. It will be your prison." Clara looked around, her eyes scanning the fog, the trees, the dark expanse that stretched before her. She could feel it, the cold, the silence, the weight of eternity. She had no idea how long she had been here, but the thought of staying in this place forever, it was unbearable. And then, she heard it. A whisper. It wasn't the figure, but something else. A voice from somewhere deep within her. "You don't have to stay." Clara closed her eyes. She had always thought of forgiveness as something that came from others, something she couldn't earn. But now, standing at the edge of this eternal place, she realized that forgiveness had to start with herself. She could keep running, trapped in her own mind, forever haunted by what she couldn't change. Or she could take a step forward, and for once, choose to let go. Taking a deep breath, Clara turned toward the figure. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready to move forward." The figure watched her, his shadow fading as the first light of dawn began to break through the mist. "Then you are free." And with that, the fog lifted, and Clara stepped onto the path before her, leaving the hollow bridge and the past behind her. Clara stood still for a moment, her heart racing as the first rays of sunlight broke through the fog. The figure, the shadowy presence that had watched over her, observed her every move, had faded into the mist, its presence dissipating like a forgotten memory. For the first time since she had crossed the hollow bridge, the oppressive feeling of being watched, of being trapped in a world that didn't belong to her, was gone. But even as the fog lifted, Clara felt the weight of something else. A deep, quiet unease stirred within her, a sense of emptiness that hadn't been there before. She had left the bridge behind, but was she truly free? The bridge had shown her parts of herself she didn't want to face, and now, those truths hung in the air, just beyond her reach. She had accepted them, but accepting them didn't make them go away. She glanced back one last time, her eyes searching the empty space where the bridge had stood. It was gone, disappeared, like it had never existed in the first place. The clearing before her stretched endlessly, the road ahead open and clear, leading into a dense forest that whispered with the wind. The trees swayed gently, as though beckoning her forward, urging her to take the next step. And yet, Clara couldn't help but feel a lingering doubt in her chest. Could she really move on? The quiet of the forest seemed to wrap itself around her like a cocoon, yet the peace it offered was different. It wasn't the kind of peace she had longed for in her dreams. It was stillness, but it was too still, as though everything in the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She took a deep breath and began walking, putting one foot in front of the other, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of moss beneath her feet. The path seemed to stretch endlessly before her, winding its way deeper into the forest. It was as though the road had no destination, as though it was a journey that would never truly end. But with each step, the feeling of emptiness grew stronger. Clara stopped and closed her eyes, allowing the quiet of the forest to wash over her. She had let go of her regrets, accepted her past, but there was something still gnawing at the edges of her mind, a question she couldn't quite shake. Why had the hollow bridge called her? Why had it chosen her? The wind stirred around her, the trees groaning as if responding to her unspoken question. She was sure of one thing: the journey was far from over. The bridge had been only the beginning. She could feel it in the air, in the way the forest seemed to pulse around her. There was something out there, something waiting, just beyond the reach of the trees. Something that was meant for her to find. With a determined breath, Clara resumed walking. She no longer had any illusions that she was just passing through this world. No, this was her path. Her journey. And whatever lay ahead, she would face it. The deeper Clara walked into the forest, the more the path began to shift. The trees grew denser, their trunks thick and gnarled, the leaves hanging heavy, casting shadows that seemed to stretch farther than the daylight could reach. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of earth and decay. There was a dampness in the air now, a coolness that settled into her bones, and with it, an unmistakable feeling of dread. She tried to shake it off, but the path ahead seemed to grow darker, the trees closer, the air thicker. A low sound echoed from somewhere in the distance, something scraping, as if claws were dragging along stone. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat, her heart pounding louder than the wind in the trees. The sound was faint, distant, but unmistakable. Clara held her breath, straining her ears for any sign of movement. The forest seemed to hold its breath, too, as though the entire world was waiting for something to happen. And then, it came, a figure, stepping out from the shadowed trees. It moved with unnatural grace, its silhouette tall and imposing against the gloom of the forest. The figure was clad in a cloak of darkness, the hood pulled low over its face, obscuring its features. Yet Clara felt it, the presence. This being, whatever it was not like the figure from the hollow bridge. This one was different. The air around it crackled with an energy that sent a chill down her spine. Clara took a step back, instinctively drawing away from the figure. But the being didn't approach her. Instead, it stood still, observing her, its gaze unblinking. There was something ancient in its presence, something timeless. "Who are you?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper, afraid that even the smallest sound would break the fragile silence around them. The figure didn't answer right away, but Clara could feel its gaze, like it was examining her from every angle, reading her thoughts, her soul. And then, finally, it spoke, not with words, but with the weight of its presence. "You've crossed the threshold," it said. Its voice was low, like the rumble of thunder far off in the distance. "You've walked through the mist, and you've faced the bridge. But you have not yet understood." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Understood what? The figure moved forward then, its cloak swirling with each step, the shadows following it as if they were alive. "The hollow bridge was just the beginning, Clara. The test you've faced is only the first of many." Clara's heart raced. "I thought I had faced everything. I thought I was free." "You are free," the figure said, its voice like the wind rustling through the trees. "But freedom is not the absence of challenge. It is the choice to continue. The bridge showed you the past, but the road ahead will show you the future." The figure raised a hand, and suddenly, the fog around them thickened once more. Clara could barely see beyond her own hands as the mist rolled in, swallowing the trees and the path ahead. She felt as though she was being drawn into something far darker than she had anticipated. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What do I have to do?" The figure paused, its silhouette nearly lost in the fog. "The future is not set. It is shaped by your choices. Your journey is far from over. You have seen your past. Now, you must choose who you will become." The mist thickened, wrapping itself around Clara like a suffocating blanket. She felt the weight of the figure's words pressing against her chest, and she understood. She hadn't been brought here just to face her past. She was being tested, but the tests would not stop. Not until she learned what she truly sought, until she made the choice that would shape the rest of her life. The fog was suffocating now, the darkness closing in around her. And though she couldn't see the figure any longer, she could still feel its presence, guiding her, waiting for her next move. Clara stood still for a moment, the weight of the figure's words settling in her chest. She had crossed the bridge. She had faced her fears. But the path ahead was unclear. It was hers to walk, hers to choose. And now, the real journey began. The figure in the mist had faded, but its presence lingered like a lingering chill in the air. Clara stood in the thick fog, her breath visible in front of her, every step forward feeling like an effort against an invisible force that pulled her backward. The silence in the forest had deepened, as though the entire world were holding its breath. The path ahead was unclear, the trees just shadows looming in the haze. Her heart raced as the weight of the figure's words pressed down on her. The bridge had been just the beginning. The real journey lay ahead, and it was one of choice, not just of the past, but of the future. Who would I become? Clara whispered the words to herself, unsure of whether she wanted to hear the answer. It felt as though the road itself was watching her, the trees stretching out like arms, pushing her forward into something greater, something unknown. But fear clawed at her, tugging at her heart. She had crossed the hollow bridge, yes, but what would this road require of her? The fog swirled, pulling tighter around her body, blurring her vision until she could barely see her own hands in front of her. She had to keep moving. There was no turning back. The feeling of being observed, judged, or even guided persisted, each step she took pulling her deeper into the mystery of the forest and the road that had opened before her. And then, through the thickening fog, she saw it, a flickering light. At first, it appeared to be a distant star, barely visible through the swirling mist. But as she walked toward it, the light grew brighter, stronger, until it felt almost tangible. The light seemed to pulse with a life of its own, like a heartbeat resonating in the air. Clara quickened her pace, her breath quickening, her pulse racing. The light was within reach now, but as she stepped closer, she could see that it was not just a light, it was a figure, standing in the center of the clearing. A woman, tall and elegant, bathed in a soft glow. Her skin shimmered with an otherworldly radiance, and her eyes glowed with an intense light that pierced through the fog, fixing on Clara. For a moment, Clara stood frozen in place, staring at the figure. She had no idea who or what it was, but something deep within her told her that the woman before her was a part of the journey. A part of the trial that awaited her. "You've come," the woman spoke softly, her voice like a melody that seemed to harmonize with the wind. "I was waiting for you." Clara swallowed, her throat dry. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman smiled gently. "I am the keeper of paths. I guard the road you walk, the choices you make. I guide those who choose to face what lies ahead, and those who are brave enough to walk into the unknown." Clara's mind spun. The unknown. "Yes," the woman said, her expression serene, almost peaceful. "The journey ahead is not just a physical one, Clara. It is a journey of the soul. You have walked the hollow bridge, faced the echoes of your past, and now you must choose which path to take. For the road ahead is not the same for everyone. It will change with every choice you make." Clara's mind whirled. The road was already shifting, growing darker, heavier. What was it the figure had said before? The truth had been revealed, but the future was yet to come. And now, standing before the keeper of paths, she realized how much was at stake. Not just her past, but her future. Her choices, each one, would carve the road she walked upon. The keeper raised a hand, and Clara felt the air shift again, this time with an undeniable force. "Your past has shaped you, but it does not define you," the woman said. "The future, however, is yours to choose. What do you seek?" Clara stared at the keeper, the weight of the question settling upon her. What did she seek? She had crossed the bridge, confronted her fears and regrets, but she hadn't known what lay beyond. And now, faced with the future, she felt more uncertain than ever. I don't know," she admitted softly, looking down at the forest floor beneath her feet, the fog swirling around her. The uncertainty, the endless questions, gripped her. "I don't know where I'm going." The keeper nodded, as if she had expected this answer. "No one truly knows," she said, her voice warm with understanding. "But each choice you make leads you to the next. And each path holds its own trials, its own lessons. But they will lead you forward, if you are willing to step into the unknown." Clara felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly smothered by doubt. The unknown was terrifying. The idea of making a choice, knowing that each decision would shape her future, that it could send her down an irreversible path, it was too much. She was scared, not of the unknown itself, but of what it might reveal. "I've already faced so much," Clara murmured. "What if I'm not strong enough to continue?" The keeper stepped closer, her radiant presence calming Clara's fears. Strength comes not from avoiding fear, but from embracing it. From choosing to walk despite it. Clara met her gaze, seeing something in the keeper's eyes, something ancient, yet full of compassion. She had crossed the bridge. She had faced the past. But now, the real journey was beginning. And she couldn't turn back. The keeper spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. "Every road leads somewhere. And every road will test you. Will you walk forward into the unknown, knowing that the road ahead is yours to shape?" Clara's heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she felt as though the weight of the world was in her hands. But then, something inside her clicked. The road wasn't a destination, it was the choices she made along the way. And though she didn't have all the answers, she knew one thing: she wasn't alone. "I will walk forward," Clara said, her voice steady, no longer trembling. "I will choose." The keeper smiled. "Then you are ready." As Clara took her first step toward the path that lay before her, the fog began to recede. The trees parted, and ahead, she could see a road that stretched into the horizon, bathed in the soft light of the rising sun. The world before her was vast, filled with infinite possibilities, and though it would not be easy, Clara knew that she was ready. The future was hers to shape. And so, with a steady heart and a determined mind, Clara stepped forward into the unknown. Clara's first steps on the new path were tentative, her heart still pounding from the intensity of her encounter with the Keeper of Paths. The mist had begun to fade, but the air was thick with something that made it feel as if every corner of the forest was waiting to see what she would do next. The trees, towering and silent, seemed to lean toward her, their branches heavy with the weight of the decision she had just made. The road before her was no longer just a dirt trail, it was a living thing, shifting beneath her feet with each step she took. The ground seemed to breathe, responding to her presence as if the world around her was alive and aware of her every movement. Clara glanced around, but there were no signs, no directions. The path was winding, leading her further into the heart of the forest, where the shadows stretched longer and the light of the day fought against the encroaching darkness. Clara didn't look back. She had made the choice to move forward, but with each step, a part of her questioned whether she was truly ready for what lay ahead. The journey that began with the hollow bridge had already revealed parts of herself she'd long ignored. But now, she understood, those trials had been only the beginning. The true test had just begun. A few steps further, and she found herself at the edge of a clearing. The forest opened up before her, but this time, something was different. The air was still, the birds and insects eerily silent. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone archway, partially covered in vines. The archway seemed ancient, its surface worn smooth by time. As Clara approached, the ground beneath her feet shifted, as though the very earth beneath her was responding to the structure in front of her. The arch seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The closer she got, the more it seemed to draw her in. There was a strange hum that filled the air, a low vibration that made her chest ache. She stopped just before the archway, her breath shallow, unsure of what to do next. "Enter," a voice echoed from behind her, though she hadn't heard anyone approach. Clara spun around, her heart in her throat. There was no one behind her. The forest was still, but the voice had been undeniable. It had come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the empty space around her like a whisper in the wind. She turned back to the archway, the hum growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a voice, it was an invitation, a call that she couldn't ignore. She had already made the decision to walk this path, but now it was clear. The path wasn't going to let her wander aimlessly. There were doors, literal and figurative, that she had to step through. And this archway, this strange, ancient structure, seemed to be the next threshold. Clara took a deep breath and stepped toward the arch. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, the world around her shifted. The air seemed to warp, bending and twisting in unnatural ways. The ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. It felt as if the very fabric of reality had unraveled, pulling her through a dimension she couldn't comprehend. The forest faded away, replaced by swirling colors, shadows, and flashes of light. For a moment, she felt herself falling, disoriented, weightless, but just as quickly as it had begun, the sensation stopped. She was standing on solid ground again, but it wasn't the forest anymore. The world around her had changed. She found herself in a city. No, not a city, but something that resembled it. The architecture was grand, towering above her, yet the structures were made of stone, ancient and weathered by time. The streets were empty, abandoned, and though the buildings were tall, they had an eerie, almost oppressive silence to them. It was as if the city had once been alive, but had long since faded into ruin. Clara looked around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. She had crossed the bridge and walked the path, but now she was somewhere completely different. There were no signs or directions, no other people to help guide her. She was utterly alone in this strange place. "Where am I?" she asked aloud, her voice echoing in the empty streets. The silence seemed to respond to her question, the wind picking up just enough to carry the faintest whisper back to her. It was a voice, but not one she could understand. It was a language lost to time, a forgotten sound that filled her with a sense of unease. "Clara," the voice whispered again, only this time, it wasn't from the air. It came from behind her. Clara spun around, her heart racing, but again, there was no one there. She was completely alone, standing in the middle of a crumbling city that seemed to stretch into eternity. "You've come far," the voice said, this time clearer. It was a deep, resonant sound, like the echoes of something ancient. "But this is not the end of your journey. This is a test. The city awaits." "Test?" Clara whispered, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean? What city?" "I." But before she could finish, the ground beneath her feet trembled, the stones shifting as if the city itself was waking up. The sky above darkened, and in the distance, Clara saw movement. A figure, tall and indistinct, appeared on one of the faraway rooftops, silhouetted against the now ominous sky. The figure didn't move toward her, instead, it simply watched. She knew then that she was being watched again. She wasn't alone here. The presence of the figure, the whispering voice, the ancient city, it was all part of the test she had been drawn into. "Enter the city," the voice commanded. "You will learn what you need to know." Clara hesitated, her mind spinning with questions. The fog from the hollow bridge had disappeared, but in its place was something far more daunting. This city was not welcoming, it was a place of mystery, of trials she was only beginning to understand. With a final deep breath, Clara took a step forward into the unknown. She was unsure of what would happen next, but she had no choice. The path ahead was hers to follow, and as she moved deeper into the city, she felt the heavy weight of destiny pressing against her, pushing her forward. The tall buildings loomed on either side. casting long shadows that seemed to watch her every move. The streets were lined with empty windows, darkened and closed off, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was waiting behind those walls. Her footsteps echoed in the hollow silence, each step growing louder as the sound bounced off the stone walls, as if the city itself was trying to claim her, trying to test her resolve. The further she walked, the more oppressive the air became, thick with ancient knowledge and forgotten memories. The wind shifted again, and the whispering voice returned. "You have not yet seen the true nature of the city, Clara. It will reveal itself to you. But first, you must make the choice. The path of light or the path of shadow?" Clara stopped in her tracks, the question hanging in the air like a weight. The path of light or the path of shadow? Which one would she choose? What did it even mean? There was so much she didn't understand, but she knew, deep down, that this was yet another decision she had to make. It was the next step in her journey. And she had to choose. Clara stood in the middle of the empty street, her mind spinning with the choice that had been presented to her. The air around her was thick, the oppressive silence almost unbearable, but she knew she had no time to waste. The city loomed on all sides, ancient and forgotten, yet still full of a strange, untapped energy. The question of light versus shadow echoed in her thoughts, demanding an answer. The figure still stood in the distance, watching her from atop one of the distant rooftops, its silhouette barely visible in the dimming light. It didn't move, didn't speak, but Clara could feel its gaze. It was waiting for her to make her choice, just as the voice had commanded. The city, the test, and whatever fate awaited her, it all rested on this moment. Path of light or path of shadow? Clara closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. It wasn't just the city that was pressing down on her, it was herself. The fear she had tried so desperately to leave behind, the uncertainty about her own decisions, and the weight of the past, all of it swirled in her mind, urging her to take one path or the other. But how could she know which one was right? She felt something in the air shift, a breeze pushing through the city streets, a whispering reminder of her journey so far. She had faced the hollow bridge, embraced the parts of herself that she had hidden for so long. But now, this was something entirely new. She wasn't just walking through an external world, she was walking through her own choices, her own soul. And yet, the question of light versus shadow still hung in the air. Which is the right choice? She asked aloud, hoping for some kind of answer, even though she knew the city, this strange place, would not give her anything so simple. The answer came not from the city, but from within her own heart. It wasn't a voice, but a feeling, a pull, deep inside. The path of light wasn't a promise of ease, of peace, or of an absence of struggle. No, it was a path of illumination, a path of clarity where truth would burn away the fog of ignorance and self-deception. The path of shadow, on the other hand, was not inherently evil. It was the path of mystery, of hidden truths and secrets. It was the road of the unknown, the path that demanded courage to face what was hidden in the dark corners of the mind and soul. In the silence of the city, Clara took a deep breath. Her hand hovered over her chest, and she realized that the decision wasn't about choosing one over the other. It was about embracing both. Light and shadow. The balance. Clara opened her eyes, looking down the road that stretched before her. The path of light and the path of shadow were not separate roads. They were one. They always had been. Each step she had taken so far, each choice she had made, had led her here, into the city, into the heart of the unknown, and now, the way forward wasn't clear, but it was hers to decide. She had crossed the hollow bridge. She had left behind the past. But this was different. The next step was about facing what was ahead, not with the expectation of certainty or clarity, but with the understanding that life itself was never fully illuminated, never fully dark. It was both light and shadow, entwined and inseparable. Clara took a step forward, the ground beneath her shifting as if the city itself were alive, responding to her decision. The fog, thick and swirling, seemed to part ever so slightly, revealing the path ahead. It wasn't straight or clear. In fact, it was more like a maze of twisting alleys and shadowy corners. But she knew, deep within herself, that she had to trust her instincts now. She had to walk forward. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not in the way she had been before. The fog that had once represented her confusion and uncertainty now felt like a presence she could navigate through, one that could be embraced, not feared. The figure watching her from the rooftop stirred. The movement was slight, but Clara caught it in the corner of her eye. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. She was walking her own path now. The figure, if it was a watcher, if it was a guide, was not going to lead her. It was simply there, a reminder that the journey was hers alone. Her steps quickened as the city around her seemed to change. The stone buildings began to shift and mold before her eyes, no longer just crumbling ruins, but structures that pulsed with life, faint and hidden beneath their worn surfaces. The air had become warmer, less oppressive, and Clara's heart settled into a steady rhythm. As she walked deeper into the city, the street ahead revealed itself to her, branching into two more paths, one covered in shadow and the other glowing faintly with light. This time, she had no doubt about her choice. Neither path was the right one, nor the wrong one. The decision was hers. She had to choose. But as her gaze lingered on the paths, a realization began to settle within her. Each step forward, whether it led through shadow or light, would ultimately be shaped by the choices she made with her heart, not her fear. Clara walked down the path bathed in shadow. She didn't know exactly where it would lead her, but she wasn't afraid anymore. There was something inherently freeing in the unknown, in the darkness. It was a place where she could find new truths, new parts of herself she had yet to uncover. She could feel the city's pulse quickening, its energy alive with possibility. The city wasn't just a place she walked through. It was a reflection of her, of everything she had been and everything she would become. She passed through narrow alleyways, the walls heavy with the weight of time. Every corner she turned seemed to reveal something new, a symbol carved into the stone, an ancient door hidden in plain sight, its edges worn down by centuries of neglect. The air seemed to shift, humming with an energy she couldn't quite grasp. At the end of the path, she reached a door, larger than any she had seen so far. It was old, with intricate patterns woven into the wood, but it looked sturdy, unyielding. As Clara approached, the whispers of the city grew louder. The low hum of energy swirled around her, but there was no fear now, only curiosity. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a vast chamber beyond. The room was dark, but at its center, there was a light. It didn't come from a lantern or a fire, but from a source beyond her understanding. The light pulsed, rhythmic, steady, as if alive. Clara stepped into the chamber, and the door slammed shut behind her. And she stood there, alone, at the heart of the city, as the light slowly grew brighter, casting long shadows on the walls and revealing the path that had always been before her. Clara stood in the center of the chamber, the door behind her now sealed shut. The silence was thick, but the pulsing light in the center of the room filled her with an odd sense of calm, as though it was calling her to step forward, to understand what had been hidden from her until now. It wasn't harsh or blinding, but soft, steady, like the warmth of a long-lost memory. It wasn't the kind of light she'd expected to find, bright and overwhelming, but rather a soft glow, a presence that seemed to welcome her rather than demand anything of her. The air in the room hummed with energy, an unspoken tension hanging between the walls. There were no windows here, no doors, just a vast, open space, its boundaries impossible to define. The room was ancient, its stone walls rough and uneven, as though the city itself had grown around this place, building up over the centuries, leaving this chamber hidden in the heart of it all. Clara approached the light cautiously, her footsteps slow but sure. As she drew closer, she could make out something at the center, a pedestal, worn by time, with a small, intricately carved object resting atop it. It looked like a key, but unlike any key she had ever seen. It was long, twisted, with symbols carved along its shaft that seemed to shimmer in the glow of the light. The moment she laid eyes on it, Clara felt an unmistakable pull, as if the key was meant for her, that it had been waiting for her arrival. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the surface of the object. The moment her skin made contact, a surge of energy shot through her, like electricity coursing through her veins. She gasped, pulling her hand back instinctively, but the connection had already been made. The key pulsed in her hand, alive with the energy of something far beyond her understanding. A voice, low and reverberating, echoed through the chamber, not from any one place, but from everywhere, filling the space around her. "The key is yours," the voice intoned. "You have chosen the path of balance, the path between light and shadow. But every key unlocks something, and every choice leads to a new door." Clara felt the weight of the voice, like the air itself was pressing down on her. The key in her hand seemed to hum, vibrating gently as though it had a life of its own. She glanced at it, feeling the pull once more. This key wasn't just a physical object, it was symbolic. It was a piece of herself, a part of her journey, and she knew that whatever door it unlocked would change everything. "Where do I go from here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. There was no immediate answer, only the pulse of the key and the shifting silence in the room. But Clara didn't need words. She knew, deep in her bones, that this key was part of something larger than herself. This city, the hollow bridge, the test she had been enduring, it was all leading her here, to this moment. And now, with the key in her possession, it was time to unlock whatever lay ahead. The chamber seemed to shift, the shadows growing darker and more intense as the light faded slightly, as if the key itself was drawing the energy from the room. Clara looked around, sensing that something was about to change, that the space she stood in was not the same as it had been moments before. The walls began to pulse, and a soft, almost imperceptible vibration moved through the floor. Clara's heart quickened in anticipation. She stepped forward again, her hand still gripping the key tightly. As she did, the shadows around her seemed to grow longer, their reach stretching toward the center of the room, surrounding her. The light faded to a dim glow, and Clara could hear the softest whispers, almost like murmurs of voices long forgotten, seeping from the walls. It wasn't fear she felt now, but a deep understanding. The city, this place, wasn't just a test of the past. It was a place of transformation. The path forward, the road she was on, would force her to confront more than just her past regrets. It would test her, yes, but it would also reveal things about herself that she could not yet comprehend. Suddenly, there was a movement, quick, fluid, just beyond the edge of her vision. Clara spun around, her heart racing. A figure stepped out from the shadows, moving gracefully toward her. The figure was tall, dressed in dark, flowing robes that seemed to melt into the shadows around them. Their face was obscured, but Clara could feel their presence, their power. "I have been waiting for you," the figure said, their voice a low murmur. "The key you hold is not merely a key. It is a guide, a beacon that illuminates the next phase of your journey. And your journey, Clara, has only just begun. Clara's grip on the key tightened. What do you mean? What journey? The figures stepped closer, their form taking on a solid, more tangible shape. Their eyes were piercing, glowing faintly in the dim light, as if they were seeing something within Clara, something she had yet to fully understand about herself. The path you are on will test you in ways you cannot yet fathom, the figure said. But the key you hold will open the doors you need to pass through. Some doors will lead to places of knowledge, of understanding. Others will take you into the deepest corners of your own soul. Some doors you must open in order to move forward. Others you must leave closed. Clara felt a chill pass through her, as though she were standing at the edge of something dangerous, something that could pull her under. She looked at the key in her hand, now glowing brighter with an almost intense energy. You must be prepared, the figure continued. The key does not just open doors to new places, it opens doors to the self. The question you must ask now is not where you are going, but who you will become once you have opened the first door. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The weight of their words settled in her chest, and for the first time, she understood. The key wasn't just a tool to get to the next place. It was a symbol of her own choices, of what she would decide to become in this moment. She could walk through the doors, yes, but each step would be a test of her strength, her willingness to face what she had yet to accept about herself. I'm ready, she whispered, more to herself than to the figure. The light from the key grew brighter, illuminating the room, casting away the shadows that had surrounded her for so long. The figure nodded, as if satisfied. Then go forward, Clara. Let the key guide you. And remember, the city will reveal itself to you when you are ready to see it. With that, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing just as suddenly as it had appeared. Clara stood alone again in the chamber, the key still glowing in her hand. Her heart was steady now, her resolve stronger than before. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but she understood now that it didn't matter. She had taken the first step. And now, she would open the door. Clara stood in the dimly lit chamber, the key in her hand still pulsing with energy, its glow the only source of light in the oppressive darkness around her. The figure had vanished, leaving her alone, yet the words it had spoken echoed in her mind. She had been told that the city would reveal itself to her when she was ready, but how was she supposed to know when she was ready? Was it the key, or was it her own choices, her own courage that would unlock the truth of this place? The walls of the chamber seemed to close in on her, their weight pressing down on her chest. The silence that had followed the figure's departure was deafening, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. But Clara couldn't stand still. Not anymore. She had come too far to turn back, and the key in her hand seemed to demand that she move forward, that she do something with the power it had given her. With a deep breath, Clara stepped toward the center of the chamber, where the soft glow of the key illuminated the pedestal. The air grew thicker as she approached, and for a moment, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, a chill crawling down her spine. Clara's fingers brushed the pedestal, and just like that, the room seemed to shift. The stone walls began to vibrate, a low hum filling the space. She felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, and before she could react, the air around her grew heavy, suffocating, and a deep, ancient voice filled the room once more. The door is open, Clara. But it is not a door you can simply walk through. Clara's heart raced. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Her throat was dry, her chest tight, but she managed to step back from the pedestal as the hum intensified, the air thick with the weight of something enormous, something beyond her understanding. The key in her hand felt warm now, its glow pulsing with each heartbeat. It seemed to hum in response to the growing energy around her, a silent signal that the door was indeed open, but not in the way she had expected. "You must choose," the voice continued, its tone both soothing and terrifying, like the deep rumble of thunder from miles away. "What lies beyond the door is a reflection of you. A part of you that you have yet to face." Clara's breath caught in her throat as the light from the key seemed to swell, casting long shadows across the walls. She didn't understand what the voice meant by a reflection. But in that moment, she realized that the journey she had begun on the hollow bridge wasn't just about crossing thresholds in the world around her. It was about crossing the thresholds within herself. As if to answer her unspoken question, the chamber began to shift once more. The walls, once solid stone, began to dissolve into mist, as if they were fading into something else. The ground beneath her feet disappeared, replaced by a soft, flowing surface, like water, though it didn't move. It was as if the room itself was transforming into something new, something alive. And through the swirling mist, Clara saw it. A doorway. Not a door in the traditional sense, but a swirling vortex of light and shadow, a circular opening that seemed to beckon her forward. The key in her hand thrummed again, and Clara stepped closer, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the pull, the weight of it. The vortex wasn't just a physical door, it was a portal to something deep within her, a place where light and shadow would collide, a place where her deepest fears, desires, and regrets would be laid bare. The voice spoke again, this time softer, more intimate. "You've come to this point, Clara. But the question remains, will you step through? Will you face the parts of yourself that have been hidden, the parts of your soul you have yet to understand?" Clara's grip on the key tightened, and for the first time, she understood. The key had not just been an object she held in her hand, it had been a part of her all along. It represented the choices she had made, the path she had walked, and the parts of herself that she had yet to reconcile. And now, the door before her wasn't just a passage through the city, it was a passage to herself. The key would unlock the parts of her soul that had been locked away, hidden in the shadows. She didn't hesitate. She had crossed the hollow bridge, faced the tests of the city, and now, she was ready to face whatever came next. With a deep breath, Clara stepped forward. The moment she crossed the threshold, everything shifted. The world around her blurred, the colors and shapes melting into each other like a dream. The mist swirled around her, and the light of the key seemed to grow brighter, until it enveloped her completely. She could feel the pulse of the key, like the beating of her own heart, driving her forward, pulling her deeper into the light and the shadows that danced within it. Suddenly, she was no longer standing in the chamber, but in a vast, infinite space, a place that felt both familiar and strange. She was no longer herself, or at least not the version of herself she had known before. Her body felt weightless, her thoughts disjointed, as though she were floating through a dream, unbound by time or place. And then, the light around her softened, and she found herself standing in a familiar setting. A place she hadn't thought of in years. Her childhood home. But it wasn't just a place. It was a memory. She stood in the living room, watching herself from a distance. Her younger self, no older than 12 or 13, sat on the couch, her face flushed with frustration as she argued with her parents. Clara could hear the words, but they weren't as clear as they should have been. It was like hearing a conversation from the other side of a window, the details blurred, the voices muffled by time and distance. She watched as her younger self stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. She saw her parents exchange a look, concern on their faces. And for a moment, Clara felt herself sinking back into the hurt and anger of that time, the confusion she had felt, the feeling of being misunderstood, the way she had withdrawn from them, as if it were easier to be angry than to open up. As the memory played out before her, Clara realized something. She hadn't forgiven herself for leaving. She hadn't forgiven herself for running away from the people she loved, from the people who had tried to understand her. She had locked that memory away, buried it deep, thinking it was too painful to face. But now, standing in the middle of that memory, Clara could see it differently. She could see how much she had changed, how far she had come, how much she had grown. The anger and resentment she had felt in that moment had been a part of her, but they didn't define her anymore. She was not that angry child. She was not the person who had walked away from everything she knew. Clara let the memory wash over her, allowing the feelings to rise, but not to control her. And as she did, she realized that forgiveness wasn't just for the people around her, it was for herself. She had to forgive herself for the mistakes she had made, for the things she had left undone. She had to forgive herself for not seeing that the path of light and shadow was not just something to choose between. It was a part of her, woven into her very being. With that realization, the room around her began to dissolve, fading into the mist once more. The light of the key dimmed, and Clara was left standing in the center of the vortex, feeling lighter, freer than she had in a long time. She had faced her past. Now, she was ready to face her future. Clara stood in the center of the shifting vortex, the pulsating light of the key still glowing faintly in her hand. The world around her was unraveling, fading into a soft blur. She could feel the edges of the memory slipping away, the childhood home dissolving into mist, leaving only the stillness of the space she now inhabited. Her breath was slow and steady, and though the past had just opened up before her, exposing the weight of her choices, she felt an undeniable clarity, a peace she had never known before. It wasn't just the forgiveness she had offered herself. It was something deeper, something that had been growing within her, that she was now finally ready to acknowledge. For the first time in her journey, Clara was fully present, no longer weighed down by the shadows of regret, no longer trapped by the burdens of the past. Her heart felt open, ready to accept whatever lay ahead. She had crossed the hollow bridge, stepped into the unknown, and now, she was no longer just walking through a strange city or facing strange tests. She was walking into herself, every part of her being aligned, ready for whatever the next phase of the journey would reveal. But the path ahead was still shrouded in mystery, still bathed in the strange glow of uncertainty. The vortex around her began to settle, the pulsating light dimming until it was no longer the focal point of the space. The mist cleared, and she found herself standing at the edge of another place entirely, a vast open field. It stretched out before her, endless and still, but not empty. The sky above was painted in hues of twilight, deep purples and soft oranges fading into one another, like the last breath of the day. The air was thick with the scent of earth, and though there was no breeze, Clara could feel the energy of the land around her. There was a sense of permanence here, of timelessness, as if the field had always existed, untouched by the passage of time. And yet, Clara knew it wasn't the place itself that was important. It was the feeling it invoked, the quiet, the anticipation of what came next. In the distance, barely visible through the haze, Clara saw another figure, a person standing at the far end of the field, framed by the fading light. They were still, their posture poised but distant, as if waiting for her to approach. She knew, instinctively, that this figure was connected to the journey she had just begun, that this meeting would be a turning point in the path ahead. The key in her hand pulsed again, and the figure moved, taking a step forward as though guided by the same unseen force. Clara felt the pull to approach, but there was hesitation in her chest. Who was this figure? What were they here to teach her? Her heart beat faster as she began walking toward them, each step sure, but laden with the knowledge that every action would lead her to a new understanding of herself. As she drew closer, the figure became clearer, its silhouette sharpening in the dimming light. They were tall, cloaked in robes that rippled with light and shadow, their face still obscured by a hood. Clara could feel the weight of their gaze, even though she couldn't see their eyes. There was something ancient about them, like they had been waiting for this moment for eons. And as she came within a few feet of them, they finally spoke, their voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight. "You have come far, Clara," the figure said, their voice a mix of warmth and authority. "But you have not yet learned the most important truth." Clara stopped before the figure, feeling the pull of their words, but also the uncertainty that now bubbled within her. "What truth?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying the hint of doubt she couldn't shake. The figure tilted their head, as though steadying her in a way that made her feel both exposed and understood. "You think you have faced your past, but you are still tethered to it. You think you have forgiven, but forgiveness is not a destination. It is a path, a continuous journey that shapes the way you move forward." Clara's heart skipped. She had thought she had let go of the anger, the pain, the confusion that had ruled her for so long. But now, standing before this figure, she felt the weight of their words. Had she really forgiven herself? Or was it something she had only hoped to do, something she had tried to do, without ever fully understanding what it meant? "What do I need to do?" she asked quietly, her grip on the key tightening. She felt a deep, quiet need to understand, to finally get it, to grasp the last piece of the puzzle she had been trying to solve since she had first crossed the hollow bridge. The figure stepped forward, moving with a grace that seemed to defy the weight of their robe. They placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, a gesture both comforting and heavy, as if grounding her in the moment. "The truth you seek lies not in your memories, nor in your forgiveness," the figure said softly. "It lies in your ability to move through them. You will always be shaped by your past. It is a part of you. But you must stop carrying it. It is not a burden, but a foundation. And now, Clara, you must choose. Will you build your future on what you have learned, or will you let your past hold you back from the life you were meant to live?" Clara's chest tightened as the weight of the question settled in her soul. The key in her hand felt warm, heavier now, pulsing with a life of its own. She had crossed the hollow bridge. She had walked the path of shadow and light, faced her regrets, and learned to forgive herself. But the choice before her now was the one she hadn't fully understood. Could she truly let go? Could she release the past without losing the lessons it had taught her? Was she strong enough to build a future without constantly looking behind her? The figure seemed to sense her hesitation. "The road ahead will not be easy. But the choice is yours. Will you choose to build? Or will you choose to be bound?" Clara took a deep breath, the weight of the figure's words pressing down on her. The field around her stretched endlessly, a metaphor for the future that lay before her, untapped and unknown. She could feel the promise of something greater, something she had yet to understand, waiting just beyond the horizon. She glanced at the key in her hand and then looked at the figure, her heart swelling with a new understanding. The journey she had been on had taught her more than she had realized. It had shown her that forgiveness was not a one-time act. It was an ongoing process, one that required letting go and choosing to step forward, despite the weight of the past. "I choose to build," Clara said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. The figure smiled, a slow, knowing smile, and nodded. "Then you are ready." The ground beneath Clara's feet shifted again, and for the first time, she felt a lightness, a freedom she had not known before. The shadows and light in her heart no longer felt at odds. They were part of her, both essential to who she was and who she would become. The key had opened the door, but now it was time to walk through it. The figure stepped back, and the light around Clara brightened, lifting the weight from her chest. She took a step forward, leaving the past behind, not in disregard, but with the understanding that she no longer needed to carry it. The path ahead was hers to shape, and she was ready to walk it. Clara's feet moved forward without hesitation, the field stretching endlessly ahead of her as she stepped into the unknown, leaving behind the figure, the swirling light, and the city that had once felt like a prison. The air around her felt lighter, almost electric, as though the very ground beneath her was shifting to support her. The key in her hand no longer felt like a weight, but a symbol of her choice, her agency, her decision to move forward. With each step, the horizon ahead seemed to grow wider, more expansive, and yet, the unknown still loomed, both inviting and intimidating. There was no turning back now. The city had been a testing ground, the hollow bridge a threshold, but what lay ahead was a road of her own making. A road built from the choices she would make from this point on. The mist that had hung around her seemed to retreat as she walked, not completely gone, but softer now, like a veil she could part with a mere thought. The twilight sky above had deepened into full night, but the stars were clear, twinkling overhead like forgotten promises. The moon, bright and full, cast a silvery light that seemed to bathe the landscape, offering her both guidance and mystery. For the first time in what felt like forever, Clara breathed in deeply, feeling both grounded and free at the same time. The sound of her footsteps on the soft earth was the only noise in the vast expanse, a rhythmic pulse in the silence. She was alone now. Alone with her thoughts, her choices, and the weight of everything she had experienced thus far. But then, a rustling sound broke the quiet. Clara stopped, every muscle in her body tensing, her heart quickening as she instinctively looked around. The sound had come from the left, from the woods that bordered the field, dark and tangled in shadow. She felt it then, a familiar presence, something that had been following her since the moment she had crossed the hollow bridge. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, cloaked in dark, flowing robes, just like the figures she had seen before. Their face was obscured by the hood, but Clara could feel their presence, strong, ancient, and unyielding. The figures stepped forward into the moonlight, their gaze fixed on her. "You've made your choice," the figure said, their voice a soft echo, but it carried a weight that seemed to reverberate through the very earth. "Now, the world you have chosen must be built." Clara stepped back slightly, unsure of the figure's intentions. "What do you mean by that?" she asked. "I've chosen. I've let go of the past." The figure nodded slowly, their eyes glowing faintly from beneath the hood. "Letting go of the past is only part of the journey. To move forward, you must understand what it means to build, to shape the world around you with intention, with purpose." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine as the figure took another step closer, their robes swaying in the breeze that had begun to pick up. "But I don't know how to build," she admitted, her voice small, vulnerable. "I'm not sure what comes next." The figure's face remained hidden, but Clara could sense that they were smiling. "You do not need to know everything at once," they said. "You only need to take the first step. Each step will reveal the next. The road ahead is yours to make, but you will not walk it alone. The path you walk, the world you create, is intertwined with everything and everyone you encounter." The figure stepped aside, and Clara's eyes followed their motion. In the distance, just beyond the edge of the field, there was a small, glowing light. It wasn't the light of the moon, nor the stars. It was something different, an orb of soft blue light, floating just above the ground, as if calling to her. "That is your first step," the figure said, nodding toward the light. Go! It is waiting for you. Clara hesitated, but only for a moment. The weight of the figure's words lingered in her chest, but they didn't feel oppressive. It wasn't fear she felt, but anticipation. There was no longer a path laid before her, there was only the act of creating the path. And in that moment, Clara realized that the uncertainty, the vast unknown, was the very thing that made her free. She was not bound by a destiny forced upon her, nor by the weight of expectations. She was the architect of her own future. With newfound resolve, Clara stepped forward, her feet carrying her toward the floating orb of light. As she approached it, the orb pulsed once, its light brighter, more vibrant. When her hand reached out to touch it, the energy radiated through her, warm and powerful, like the first breath of a new dawn. The world around her began to shift again, but this time, Clara felt no fear. The path ahead was unfolding, not with the clarity of a map, but with the uncertainty of possibility. Every step she took was an act of creation, every decision shaping the world she was walking into. The orb of light slowly dissolved, and the field around her transformed. The soft earth beneath her feet shifted into something more solid, stone, marble, and what began to appear in the landscape, the outline of a small building emerging in the distance, crafted with intention and precision. It wasn't a city, not yet. But it was a foundation. A starting point. It was her first step, her first creation. The figure, who had stood silently by her side, now stepped forward, their voice carrying a quiet, knowing tone. You have taken your first step, Clara. The world will take shape as you do. But remember, it will not be easy. Every choice you make will ripple through the world you are building. Clara turned to face them, a sense of calm settling over her. I understand, she said softly. I don't have all the answers, but I'm ready to create something new. The figure gave a single, slow nod, their presence fading as the light from the orb dimmed. As the landscape around her began to solidify, Clara stood in the center of her creation, the weight of her choice still lingering in her chest, but now, it was a weight she could carry. She had chosen the path of light and shadow, the path of creation, and with each step, she would build something new. Her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Clara stood in the heart of the field, the orb of light dissipating before her eyes. The world around her was changing, shifting, as if the landscape itself were coming alive, responding to the energy she had just summoned. The marble stone beneath her feet solidified, transforming into the foundation of something more, something real, something that she had not just discovered but had created. Her chest swelled with a sense of accomplishment, but also uncertainty. The road ahead was vast, stretching into the unknown, a landscape that had yet to be fully formed. She had begun the process of building her future, but she knew now that it was not a one-time decision. It was a journey, a series of steps that would take her through both light and shadow, joy and sorrow. The key in her hand, once a symbol of uncertainty, now felt like an anchor, a constant reminder that her choices were hers to make. The figure, who had watched silently from the edge of the field, now moved toward her. The shadows that had once clung to their robes seemed to dissipate as they stepped into the light, the mystery around them giving way to a clear, calm presence. They were not imposing now, but reassuring. Their gaze met Clara's, and though their face was still partially obscured by their hood, there was something in their posture, a softness, a certainty, that Clara had not seen before. You have chosen, Clara, the figure said, their voice steady, filled with both respect and something else, something like pride. You have crossed the threshold and begun to build. The world will respond to you, just as you have responded to it. But you must understand, this is only the beginning. Clara nodded, absorbing their words. but something nagged at the back of her mind. She had come so far, but the weight of the journey still felt heavy. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How do I know if I'm building the right things?" The figure gave a small, knowing smile. "There is no right way to build. The world you create will reflect the choices you make, but those choices will not always be clear, nor will they always be easy. What you are building, what we are building, isn't a place, but a way of being. It's not just about what you create around you. It's about what you create within yourself. The future is not a place, but a direction. It is not a destination, but a journey." Clara's gaze dropped to the ground, where the stone floor now stretched out, forming the first walls of a small building, a home of sorts. It was simple, but it felt right. This wasn't a city. It was something more personal, something that would grow with her. She could see the potential of it, the empty spaces waiting to be filled with purpose. But even as the foundation took shape, the questions lingered in her mind. "How do I know I'm not just lost?" Clara asked, the words coming out before she could stop them. "How do I know I'm not just running in circles, making things up as I go?" The figures stepped closer, their presence gentle yet firm. "We are all lost at times, Clara. But it's in the journey that we find ourselves. You're not meant to have all the answers now, but you will find the direction you seek if you keep moving forward. The road ahead is not linear. It's shaped by your choices, your intentions, and your willingness to face both the light and the shadow within you." Clara closed her eyes, taking in their words. They were comforting, but she still felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. How much could she really control? She had built the foundation of her life, but it was like constructing a house without knowing what rooms she'd need, or what purpose they would serve. It was a leap of faith. "Why did the bridge call me?" she asked, her voice quiet now. "Why me?" The figures seemed to pause, as if considering the question carefully. When they spoke, their voice was softer. "The hollow bridge calls to those who are ready to confront themselves, to face the parts of their soul that are hidden from the world. It does not choose randomly. You were called because you have the strength to walk this path. You have always had that strength, Clara. You simply needed to remember." Clara's chest tightened at their words. She had always felt like she was searching for something, searching for answers, for purpose, for a way out of the confusion that had defined so much of her life. But she had never seen herself as someone strong, not until now. Maybe the strength hadn't been something she needed to find. It had been within her all along, just waiting for her to step into it. The figure spoke again, their tone shifting slightly, becoming more urgent. "The foundation you've begun is only one part of the journey. You must be prepared for what lies ahead, for the choices that will come next. You will be tested again, in ways that will challenge everything you think you know. The light and shadow that exist within you will need to be reconciled. And the world around you will reflect that reconciliation. The balance you seek will not come easily." Clara met the figure's gaze. For the first time, she understood the gravity of their words. This wasn't just a journey about discovering her purpose. It was about learning to live with both the light and the darkness, to integrate both sides of herself into something whole. She wasn't just building a physical world. She was building a soul that could hold the weight of both joy and sorrow, hope and despair. "I'm ready," Clara said, her voice steadier now, filled with determination. She didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but she knew she couldn't keep running from the unknown. She couldn't hide from her own fears and regrets anymore. "I will build," she continued, "and I will face whatever comes next." The figure nodded, their face softening with approval. Then you are ready to move forward, Clara. The road ahead is yours to walk, but you will not walk it alone. The world will open up to you, and you will find the connections that will guide you, just as you will guide others. Clara felt a surge of energy flow through her. The key in her hand pulsed one final time, its light dimming and then fading altogether, leaving her in the soft glow of the moonlight. The figures stepped back, their form beginning to dissolve into the mist that had once surrounded the field. "Remember," the figure said, their voice a fading echo, "you have already begun. The rest is up to you." And with that, they were gone. Clara stood alone in the field, but now, it didn't feel like emptiness. The silence was no longer oppressive, it was full of potential. She looked around, the foundation of her creation standing firm before her, but she knew it wasn't just the physical space that mattered. It was the emotional and spiritual space she had created within herself. She had faced the hollow bridge, made the choices, and now, the road ahead was clear. Her journey had only just begun. In this conclusion, Clara has fully embraced the journey of self-discovery, creation, and balance. She has crossed the hollow bridge, faced her past, and made the difficult decision to build a new future, one step at a time. The figure's words serve as both guidance and challenge, reminding her that the path ahead will continue to test her. The world she creates is not just a physical one, but a reflection of her inner growth. Clara is now ready to face whatever comes next, armed with the strength to navigate both the light and the shadow within herself. Her journey is far from over, but with each choice, she will shape the world around her, forging her own destiny. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.